The sound of hoofbeats thundered across the valley as Makya and his fellow scouts crested the ridge, their keen eyes scanning the horizon. What they discovered below would haunt them forever. Remnants of a wagon train scattered across the plains, broken wheels and splintered wood glistening in the harsh afternoon sun. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Bodies lay still, a massacre laid bare. But beneath the horror, something stirred, a faint breath, a heartbeat refusing to surrender. This is the story of Rebecca Morgan, the woman who survived the unthinkable, and the Lakota scout whose compassion would forever change her destiny. In the spring of 1853, the rolling landscapes of the Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly before Rebecca Morgan's eyes. The morning air carried the fragrance of sage and wildflowers, but to Becca, it only reminded her of what she had left behind. The sweet apple blossoms in her father's Ohio orchard, the predictable comfort of her life before Samuel had convinced her to seek fortune in Oregon Territory. Becca sat at the edge of the wagon train's encampment, her leather journal open on her lap. The pages fluttered in the gentle breeze as she wrote by the light of the early morning sun. Her fingers, once soft and unblemished, now bore the calluses of frontier life. 3 months of washing clothes in cold streams, cooking over open fires, and mending torn canvas until her hands bled. Still writing your memories? Samuel's voice startled her. He stood behind her, his silhouette outlined by the rising sun, the golden light catching the edges of his brown hair. Becca smiled, closing the journal. Not memories, dreams. What our farm might look like when we reach Oregon. She tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear, her green eyes finding his. Father always said writing makes wishes more likely to come true. Samuel nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners when he smiled. He had changed since they'd left Ohio. The journey had hardened him, weathered his once smooth face like it had weathered the wagons themselves. Thomas says we'll reach Devil's Gate by sundown. Sweetwater River runs through it. We can rest, and there for a day or two. Becca fingered the gold locket around her neck, the only piece of her mother she had left. Inside lay a small portrait of her parents, painted in what felt like another lifetime. "Is it safe there?" she asked, though she knew safety was a relative term on the trail west. "As safe as anywhere," Samuel replied, offering his hand to help her up. "Come on. Mary's watching little Sophie cry over a scraped knee like it's a broken leg." Becca rose, tucking her journal into her satchel. As a doctor's daughter, she had become the unofficial healer of their 12-wagon train. Not that her father had ever trained her properly. Women weren't meant for medicine, he'd said. But she'd watched, learned, and remembered everything. It had saved lives already on this journey. The wagon train moved slowly that day, the oxen plodding methodically through the rugged terrain. Becca rode in their wagon, checking their supplies and organizing her small collection of medicinal herbs. The wooden box containing her father's instruments, gifted reluctantly when he realized they'd have no physician on their journey, sat secured beneath their bedding. The brass scales, glass bottles, and surgical tools represented her most valuable contribution to their traveling community. Thomas Wilson, the wagon master, was a gruff man with a steel-gray beard and eyes that had seen too many prairie storms. He pushed them hard, determined to reach Oregon before the autumn storms made mountain passes impassable. "Keep moving," he would call whenever wheels stuck or spirits flagged. "The wilderness doesn't forgive the slow." As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the plain, the jagged silhouette of Devil's Gate came into view. The massive granite walls rose like sentinels on either side of the Sweetwater River, creating a narrow passage that pioneers had used for years on their westward journey. "We'll camp at the eastern entrance," Thomas announced, his voice carrying over the creak of wagon wheels. "Water's good there, and there's grazing for the animals." Becca felt a peculiar chill as they approached the towering rock formation. The evening light cast strange shadows across its face, creating shapes that seemed almost human, watching, waiting. She dismissed the thought as foolishness born of exhaustion. That night, as the travelers gathered around their fires, an unusual tension hung in the air. Samuel sat close to Becca, his arm protectively around her shoulders, as they listened to Thomas recount tales of previous journeys through this stretch of wilderness. "The Lakota sometimes watch from those ridges," Thomas said, pointing toward the darkened hills. "They've left most wagon trains alone this season, but keep your rifles close all the same." Becca noticed how the flames cast deep shadows across Thomas's weathered face, making his expression look grim, almost prophetic. She shivered despite the fire's warmth. "Are you cold?" Samuel whispered, pulling her closer. "No," she replied, though she couldn't explain the dread settling in her stomach. "Just tired." Later, as they prepared for sleep in their wagon, Samuel checked his rifle before placing it within arm's reach. "Just a precaution," he assured her, noticing her watchful eyes. Becca nodded, removing her locket and carefully placing it in the small wooden box where she kept her most treasured possessions: her journal, her mother's handkerchief, and a small packet of seeds from her father's garden. Tomorrow, they would continue their journey through the passage. Tomorrow would be another day closer to their new life. She couldn't have known it would be their last night together. The attack came at dawn. Becca awoke to screams and gunfire. Samuel was already scrambling for his rifle, his face pale in the early light filtering through the canvas. "Stay down," he ordered, pushing her toward the floor of the wagon. "Don't move." Before she could speak, he was gone, leaping from the wagon into chaos. Becca's heart hammered against her ribs as the sounds of conflict intensified. Men shouting, women screaming, horses neighing in terror. Gunshots cracked through the air like lightning. She pressed herself against the wooden planks, paralyzed with fear. Through a gap in the canvas, she glimpsed figures on horseback circling the wagons, firing rifles and swinging axes. But they weren't Lakota, as Thomas had feared. These were men with bandanas covering their faces, their horses unadorned, their movements coordinated and deliberate. Bandits, outlaws, vultures preying on vulnerable travelers. A bullet tore through the canvas above her head. Becca stifled a scream, crawling toward the back of the wagon. The small chest containing her medical supplies tumbled over as the wagon rocked violently. Glass shattered, the smell of herbs and tinctures filling the enclosed space. The gunfire intensified, then gradually subsided. In its place came something worse, the methodical sounds of the outlaws moving from wagon to wagon, finishing what they had started. Footsteps approached, heavy boots on hard ground. With trembling hands, Becca reached for the hunting knife Samuel kept wrapped in oilskin beneath their bedroll. The leather grip felt alien in her palm, but she clutched it tightly, pressing herself into the darkest corner of the wagon. The canvas flap was ripped open. A man with cold eyes and 3 days' worth of stubble peered in, rifle in hand. His gaze locked with Becca's. For one eternal moment, they stared at each other, predator and prey. Then his lips curled into a smile that chilled her blood. He raised his rifle. The blast deafened her. Pain exploded in her shoulder, searing like a white-hot brand. Becca fell backward, the knife slipping from her grasp. The outlaw climbed into the wagon, rummaging through their possessions, tossing aside anything he deemed worthless. Through a haze of pain, Becca watched him pocket Samuel's pocket watch and her wooden box of treasures. The gold locket would fetch a good price somewhere. The journal would be discarded as worthless. "Nothing but trinkets," the man muttered, turning back toward her. "Waste of ammunition." He raised his rifle again, aiming at her head. Becca closed her eyes. A shout from outside. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Riders coming! Grab what you can and go!" The outlaw hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. With a curse, he climbed out of the wagon, leaving Becca bleeding on the wooden planks. The sounds shifted, horses galloping away, voices fading. Then, silence, heavy and absolute, broken only by the occasional groan of the dying. Consciousness ebbed and flowed like a tide. At times, Becca was aware of the warm blood soaking her dress, the throbbing pain in her shoulder. At others, she floated. In darkness, Samuel's face appearing before her, then dissolving into nothing. She didn't know how much time had passed when rough hands pulled her from the wagon. Unable to resist, she fell to the ground, a cry of pain escaping her lips. Through half-closed eyes, she saw men moving among the bodies, taking whatever valuables remained. "This one's still breathing," a voice said above her. "Not for long," another replied. "Bullet wounds bad. Leave her." They dragged her a short distance, tossing her carelessly among the bodies of her fellow travelers. Becca felt herself landing on something soft, someone's body. She wanted to scream, to push away, but couldn't summon the strength. As darkness closed in again, the last thing she saw was Samuel's face, unmoving, his eyes staring sightlessly at the vast blue sky above. Time lost all meaning. Day bled into night and back into day. Becca drifted in and out of consciousness, aware occasionally of the buzzing flies, the growing stench of death, the weight of bodies around her. The bullet wound in her shoulder burned like fire, then grew strangely cold. Fever dreams tortured her, Samuel calling her name, her father's disappointed face when she'd announced they were heading west, her mother's locket swinging like a pendulum, marking the seconds of her fading life. Water. She needed water desperately. Her tongue felt swollen, her lips cracked and bleeding. The heat of the day beat down mercilessly, then gave way to the bone-deep cold of the Wyoming nights. In her lucid moments, Becca realized the outlaws had believed her dead, had thrown her body among the others. The thought of Samuel's lifeless form nearby made her want to surrender to the darkness permanently, but something inside her refused to yield. A stubborn flicker of life that would not be extinguished. On what might have been the third day, or the fourth, she could no longer tell, Becca became aware of a sound. Hoofbeats. Riders approaching. Had the outlaws returned to ensure they'd left no survivors? She remained motionless, barely breathing, as the riders drew closer. Voices carried on the wind, speaking a language she didn't understand. Not English, and not the crude Spanish she'd heard from traders back in Ohio. With immense effort, Becca opened her eyes slightly. Through the narrow slit of her vision, she saw them. 3 men on horseback, moving slowly through the Massacre. Sight. Their features were sharp and dignified, their long hair adorned with feathers. Lakota. The scouts moved methodically, examining the scene with grave expressions. One dismounted, kneeling beside a body, murmuring words Becca couldn't understand. They would leave, she realized with despair. They would leave, believing everyone dead, and she would join the others in this makeshift grave beneath the vast Wyoming sky. With what felt like the last of her strength, Becca moved her fingers, just enough to disturb a small stone near her hand. It rolled a short distance, coming to rest against a broken wagon wheel. The youngest scout turned sharply at the sound, his hand going to the knife at his belt. Keen eyes scanned the bodies, searching for movement. Slowly he approached, his moccasin-clad feet making no sound on the hard ground. Becca's heart thundered in her chest as he drew closer. Would he end her suffering with his knife? Or would he show mercy to a white woman whose people had encroached upon his lands? He stood over her now, his silhouette blocking the harsh sun. With trembling effort, Becca fully opened her eyes, meeting his gaze directly. Recognition flashed across his face. Surprise, then alarm. He called to the others in his language, dropping to his knees beside her. "Water," Becca whispered. word barely audible through her parched lips. Understanding transcended language. The scout uncorked a skin container at his belt, gently lifting her head and bringing it to her lips. The water tasted of life itself, cool and sweet upon her tongue. The other scouts joined them, speaking rapidly amongst themselves. The youngest, the one who had found her, carefully examined her wounded shoulder, his expression grim but determined. "Makya," he said, touching his chest, then pointing to her questioningly. "Becca," she managed to reply, her voice a dry rasp. Makya nodded, then spoke to the others. A decision seemed to be reached. With surprising gentleness, he slid his arms beneath her, lifting her from the tangle of bodies. Pain shot through her. Shoulder and darkness threatened at the edges of her vision. The last thing Becca remembered was being placed on a horse, Makya mounting behind her, his arms steady around her waist to keep her from falling. Then the blessed darkness claimed her once more. Consciousness returned slowly, like the gradual lightening of the sky before dawn. Becca became aware of sensations one by one, soft furs beneath her, the crackling of a fire, the smell of herbs and smoke, voices murmuring in the Lakota language. Her eyelids felt impossibly heavy, but she forced them open. She lay inside a teepee, the smoke hole at its peak, revealing a patch of star-filled sky. Her wound had been dressed with some kind of poultice, the pain dulled to a manageable throb. Movement caught her eye. A woman knelt beside her, grinding something in a stone. "Mortar!" She looked up, meeting Becca's gaze. Without speaking, she set aside her work and brought a wooden cup to Becca's lips. The liquid was bitter, but not unpleasant. "Thank you," Becca whispered after drinking. The woman didn't respond, simply returning to her task. Minutes or hours later, Becca couldn't tell. The teepee flap opened and Makya entered, accompanied by an older man whose bearings suggested authority. Makya spoke to the older man, gesturing toward Becca. The man, a leader of some kind, Becca guessed, studied her with piercing eyes that seemed to look through her rather than at her. "Little wolf," Makya said, indicating the older man, then touching his own chest. "Makya." "Becca," she replied, her voice stronger than before. Little Wolf spoke at length, with Makya listening attentively. When he finished, Makya turned to Becca and, to her surprise, spoke in halting English. "You safe here? Many sons? Then—" He made a walking motion with his fingers. "Fort Bridger," Becca realized, the nearest military outpost. They intended to take her there once she was strong enough to travel. Over the days that followed, Becca's strength gradually returned. The Lakota healer, a woman named Wachiwi, tended her wound with remarkable skill, applying fresh poultices and herbal teas that fought the infection that had nearly claimed her life. Makya visited daily, usually at dawn and dusk. His English improved with each conversation, and Becca found herself learning Lakota words in return. She learned that he had been taught by a trapper who had lived among his people for several winters, trading furs and stories. "Why help me?" Becca asked, one evening as Makya sat cross-legged beside her, carefully repairing a tear in his buckskin shirt. He paused, considering her question. "All life. Sacred," he replied. "White, Lakota, no matter." His answer shamed her. Would white settlers have shown the same mercy to an injured Lakota? Becca knew the answer all too well. As her strength returned, restlessness grew within her. The faces of the dead, Samuel, Thomas, Mary, and her little Sophie, haunted her dreams. The outlaws had taken everything, including her locket, the last connection to her past. One morning, finding herself alone in the teepee, Becca attempted to stand. Her legs trembled beneath her, weak from disuse, but held. Wrapping a borrowed blanket around her shoulders, she pushed aside the teepee flap and stepped into the light of day. The Lakota camp spread before her. Dozens of teepees arranged in a circle, women working at cooking fires, children playing with dogs, men crafting weapons or tending to horses. The encampment sat in a protected valley with the majestic Medicine. Bow Mountains rising in the distance, eyes turned toward her, curious, wary, some hostile. Becca stood frozen, suddenly aware of her intrusion into their world. A young girl approached, offering a piece of dried meat. Becca accepted it with a grateful smile. The simple act of kindness amidst the staring eyes gave her courage. Slowly, she made her way through the camp, nodding respectfully to those she passed. Some nodded in return, others turned away. She was an outsider, a white woman whose people had brought nothing but trouble to the Lakota. She found Makya at the edge of the camp, grooming a handsome pinto horse. He looked up at her approach, surprise evident in his expression. "You walk," he said, stating the obvious. "I walk," she confirmed. "Thank you for saving me." Makya's eyes held hers for a long moment. "Not me alone. Wachiwi heal. Little wolf, allow." Becca nodded, understanding the complexity of her presence among them. "When will you take me to the fort?" "When next moon begins," he replied, pointing to the waning quarter moon visible even in the daylight sky. 4 or 5 days until she would return to the white world to try to piece together what remained of her life. The thought brought no comfort, only a hollow feeling in her chest. "I would learn," she said suddenly, "while I am here, your healing ways." Makya's eyebrows rose in surprise. He studied her face, perhaps looking for the truth behind her words. My father was a doctor," she explained. "I know some medicine. Your ways are different. Better, for some things." After a moment's consideration, he nodded. "I ask, Wachiwi." To Becca's surprise, the Lakota healer agreed. Perhaps she saw something in Becca that others didn't, a genuine respect for knowledge different from her own. Or perhaps she simply welcomed another pair of hands to help gather and prepare. The plants she used in her healing work. The days that followed established a routine. In the mornings, Becca would accompany Wachiwi to collect plants, learning their names, their uses, how to prepare them. In the afternoons, she would watch and assist as Wachiwi tended to the sick or injured in the camp. Though they shared few words, a rapport developed between them, a language of hands and eyes and shared purpose. Makya often joined them on their morning excursions, acting as translator when necessary. Becca learned that he was the youngest son of a respected warrior, being groomed to follow in his father's footsteps. His skill as a scout had earned him a place among those chosen to patrol the boundaries of Lakota Territory. "It was you who found the wagon train," Becca said one morning as they dug for prairie turnip roots. Makya nodded, his expression darkening. "Many dead. Bad men, not Lakota." "I know," Becca replied softly. "I saw them. White soldiers blame Indian," he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Always blame." Becca couldn't deny the truth of his words. She had heard Thomas and the other men discussing Indian attacks on wagon trains, only to learn later that many were the work of white outlaws who knew the blame would fall elsewhere. "I will tell the truth," she promised. "When I reach the fort." Makya looked at her skeptically. White ears closed to Indian truth, even from white woman lips. His skepticism stung, but Becca knew it was warranted. "Then I must make them listen." That night, a celebration took place in the camp. A successful buffalo hunt had brought meat and hides, ensuring the tribe's comfort for the coming weeks. Drums beat a hypnotic rhythm as dancers moved around the central fire, their movements telling stories Becca couldn't understand but could feel in her bones. She sat slightly apart, aware of her status as outsider, yet strangely drawn to the primal power of the ceremony. Makya found her there, offering a wooden bowl of stew. "You should eat," he said, sitting beside her. "Buffalo gives strength." Becca accepted the bowl gratefully. They sat in companionable silence, watching the dancers, the firelight painting their faces in gold and shadow. "Tomorrow," Makya said finally, "we go to fort." Becca's stomach tightened. She had known this moment would come, yet found herself strangely reluctant to leave. "So soon?" "Soldiers search for outlaws," he explained. "Better you go now. Safer." That night, Becca lay awake in the teepee, listening to the night sounds of the camp, the distant howl of a wolf, the soft whickering of horses, the whisper of the wind against the hide walls. Tomorrow, she would return to the white world, to people who would look at Makya and his tribe with fear and suspicion. The thought filled her with a profound sadness. Dawn broke clear and cold. Becca dressed in clothes Wachiwi had given her, a simple dress of soft deer hide, moccasins that fit her feet perfectly, a warm blanket to ward off the morning chill. Her wound had healed remarkably well under the Lakota woman's care, leaving only a puckered scar as a reminder of how close death had come. Makya waited at the edge of the camp with 3 other scouts, including Little Wolf. 4 horses stood ready, one bearing packs of provisions for the journey. The fort was 2 days' ride, Makya had explained, if the weather held and they encountered. No trouble. Wachiwi approached as Becca prepared to leave, pressing a small leather pouch into her hand. Inside were dried herbs and roots, healing medicines from the land. "Thank you," Becca said, embracing the older woman. To her surprise, Wachiwi returned the embrace. The small party set out as the sun cleared the eastern hills, casting long shadows across the valley. Becca rode alongside Makya, acutely aware that each hoofbeat carried her further from the unexpected sanctuary she had found and closer to an uncertain future. They traveled in silence for the most part, the scouts alert for any sign of trouble. By midday, they had left the sheltered valley behind, following a winding path through rolling hills dotted with sage and juniper. "There," Makya said, pointing to a distinctive rock formation in the distance. "Independence Rock, many white names carved there." Becca nodded. She had heard of the landmark, the Register of the Desert, where thousands of emigrants had carved their names as they passed on the Oregon Trail. "We camp there tonight," he continued. "Reach fort tomorrow." As they approached the massive granite dome, Becca could see the names etched into its surface, a permanent record of those who had passed this way, seeking new beginnings in the West. Would Samuel's name have been carved there if they had made it this far together? Would hers? They made camp in the shelter of the rock as the sun began its descent. Little Wolf and the other scouts moved off to hunt for the evening meal, leaving Becca and Makya to gather firewood and prepare the camp. "Will you return to your family?" Makya asked as they worked, breaking the long silence between them. Becca paused, a bundle of sagebrush in her arms. "I have no family," she said quietly. "My parents died before we left Ohio. Samuel was all I had." Makya's expression softened with understanding. "What will you do?" It was the question that had haunted her sleepless nights. What would she do? Where would she go? A woman alone in the West faced limited options, none of them particularly appealing. "I don't know," she admitted. "Perhaps I'll continue to Oregon. That was our plan." Makya nodded, though his eyes suggested he doubted the wisdom of such a journey. "Soldiers at fort will help," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. As twilight deepened into night, Little Wolf returned with a brace of rabbits. The meal was simple but satisfying, the 4 scouts and Becca sitting in a circle around the small fire. The conversation flowed in Lakota, with Makya occasionally translating bits for Becca's benefit. Later, as the others slept, Becca remained awake, gazing at the star-strewn sky above. Makya sat nearby, keeping watch for the first half of the Night. Your stars, she said softly, pointing upward. Do they have stories? Makya followed her gaze. Many stories, he replied. That one, he pointed to a bright star near the horizon, shows the way home when hunters are lost. Becca smiled sadly. I wish there was a star to show me the way home. Home is not place, Makya said after a thoughtful pause. Home is... He touched his chest, searching for the English word, heart. The simplicity and truth of his statement brought unexpected tears to Becca's eyes. She turned away, not wanting him to see. Sleep, Makya said gently. Long journey tomorrow. Dawn had barely broken when the sound of hoofbeats woke them. Many hoofbeats, too many to be anything but trouble. Little Wolf was on his feet instantly, signaling the others to douse the remains of their fire. Makya moved to Becca's side, his expression tense. Soldiers, he whispered. Many. Becca's heart sank. A large party of soldiers this far from the fort could only mean one thing. They were hunting hostile Indians, and finding a white woman in the company of Lakota scouts would create a dangerous situation for everyone. I'll speak to them, she said, rising to her feet. Explain that you saved me. Makya shook his head. Soldiers shoot first. Listen later. Little Wolf conferred rapidly with the other scouts, then approached Becca and Makya. He spoke urgently. In Lakota. We must go, Makya translated. Now, before they see. Becca's mind raced. The soldiers were her people, yet she feared what they might do if they discovered her with the Lakota. The massacre of her wagon train was fresh evidence of white hostility toward natives, justified or not. No, she decided. I'll stay, meet them, tell them what really happened. Little Wolf's expression darkened, but he seemed to understand. Her reasoning. He spoke again, this time directly to Makya. He says, I stay with you, Makya translated, though his face showed reluctance. Others go. Safer. The two other scouts mounted quickly, disappearing into the early morning shadows. With practiced stealth, Little Wolf clasped Makya's arm briefly, then did the same, leaving Becca and Makya alone at the campsite. You should have gone, Becca said, fear gnawing at her stomach. It's not safe. I promised, Makya replied simply, take you to fort. The soldiers appeared on the ridge above them. At least 20 men, their blue uniforms stark against the pale morning sky. At their head rode an officer whose bearing suggested authority. Down there, one of the soldiers shouted, pointing toward their campsite. The patrol descended the slope at a trot, rifles raised. Becca stepped forward, hands raised in a gesture of peace. Makya stood slightly behind her, his face impassive but his body tense. Hold your fire, she called. I'm Rebecca Morgan, survivor of the Devil's Gate Massacre. The soldiers slowed their approach, confusion evident on their faces. The officer, a captain, Becca now saw, raised his hand, ordering his men to hold position. Ma'am, he called, incredulous. What in God's name are you doing out here with this savage? The derogatory term made Becca's blood boil, but she kept her voice steady. This man saved my life, Captain. He and his people found me after outlaws attacked our wagon train at Devil's Gate. They've been caring for me, healing my wounds. The captain's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Outlaws, you say? We had reports of an Indian attack. Reports from whom? Becca challenged. There were no survivors but me. Step away from the Indian, ma'am, the captain ordered, ignoring her question. We'll escort you to Fort Bridger. Not without Makya, Becca insisted. He stays with me. The tension in the air thickened. Several soldiers kept their rifles trained on Makya, who remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the captain. That's not possible, the captain said, his voice hardening. We have orders to bring in any Lakota found outside their hunting grounds. There have been attacks. Not by the Lakota, Becca interrupted. The men who attacked my wagon train were white. Outlaws. I saw them clearly. The Lakota have shown me nothing but kindness." The captain's expression suggested he didn't believe her, or worse, didn't care for the truth. He dismounted, approaching slowly. "You've been through a terrible ordeal, ma'am. These savages have clearly confused you." "I am not confused, Captain." Becca cut in, her voice like steel. "I know exactly what happened to my husband and our friends, and I know exactly who saved me from the same fate." The captain's face hardened. He signaled to two of his men, who dismounted and moved toward her. "Take Mrs. Morgan to the medical wagon," he ordered, "and secure that Indian." Everything happened at once. The soldiers lunged forward. Makya tensed, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. Becca stepped between them, facing the captain directly. "If you harm him," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the tense space, "I will ensure every newspaper from here to Washington hears how Captain—" She glanced at his nameplate. "Hayes left American citizens to die at the hands of outlaws, then threatened the natives who saved the sole survivor." Captain Hayes froze, his eyes narrowing. "Are you threatening me, ma'am?" "I'm promising you the truth," Becca replied. "My father was friends with the editor of the Cincinnati Gazette. My story will be told, one way or another." A long moment passed, the tension crackling like the static before a storm. Finally, Hayes stepped back. "Fine," he said curtly. "Your friend can accompany us to the fort, but he rides under guard, and I take no responsibility for how the colonel receives him." Becca nodded, knowing it was the best compromise she could hope for. She turned to Makya, whose expression held a mixture of surprise and something that might have been admiration. "We go together," she said softly. "I won't let them harm you." Makya's eyes met hers, dark and inscrutable. "You have warrior heart," he replied, equally soft. Fort Bridger rose from the plains like an island of civilization in a sea of wilderness. Wooden palisades surrounding a collection of buildings, the American flag snapping in the breeze above the main gate. To Becca, who had spent weeks among the organic curves and natural materials of the Lakota camp, the fort's rigid lines and right angles seemed strange and artificial. Captain Hayes's patrol entered the fort at midday, creating a stir among the soldiers and civilians inside. A white woman and a Lakota scout, riding side by side under military escort, was not a sight they witnessed every day. Colonel James Fletcher, the fort's commanding officer, received them in his office, a Spartan room with a desk, 3 chairs and maps covering the walls. His weathered face betrayed no emotion as Becca recounted her story, the attack on the wagon train, her days hidden. Among the dead, her rescue by the Lakota scouts. "And you're certain they were white men who attacked you?" the colonel asked, his gray eyes sharp beneath bushy brows. "Absolutely certain," Becca replied. "They wore bandanas over their faces, but their speech, their clothing, their weapons, all white, not Lakota." The colonel nodded slowly, turning his attention to Makya, who stood silently near the door, a soldier on either side of him. "And you," he addressed Makya directly, "why would your people help a white woman?" Makya met the colonel's gaze unflinchingly. "All life sacred," he replied simply. Fletcher studied him for a long moment, then turned back to Becca. "You understand, Mrs. Morgan, that your account contradicts everything we've been told about the Devil's Gate incident." "By whom?" Becca challenged, echoing her earlier question to Hayes. "Who told you it was a Lakota attack when there were supposedly no survivors?" The colonel's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, of the inconsistency in the official narrative. "I'll have my men investigate further," he said finally. "In the meantime, Mrs. Morgan, we'll arrange quarters for you among the officers' families. As for your companion," he glanced at Makya, "he will be treated as our guest, not our prisoner, on account of his service to you." Relief washed over Becca. It wasn't ideal, but it was a start. "Thank you, Colonel." As they were dismissed, a young lieutenant was assigned to escort Becca to the quarters of Mrs. Peterson, the quartermaster's wife, while Makya was led to a separate building where native scouts and interpreters were occasionally housed. Before they parted, Becca turned to Makya. "I'll come find you tomorrow," she promised. Makya nodded, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Be careful," he replied softly. "Not all enemies wear war paint." Fort Bridger proved to be a complex microcosm of frontier society. The military personnel and their families occupied the heart of the compound, while traders, trappers, and travelers formed a transient community around its edges. Rumors and gossip circulated as freely as goods and supplies. Mrs. Peterson was a kind but garrulous woman who embraced Becca with genuine sympathy while bombarding her with questions about her ordeal. Becca provided abbreviated answers, keeping the details of her time with the Lakota vague and focusing instead on the attack itself. "Such terrible savages," Mrs. Peterson clucked, misunderstanding entirely which group Becca feared. "Though I must say it's extraordinary that those Lakota didn't finish what the others started." Becca bit her tongue, knowing that contradicting her hostess directly would accomplish nothing. Instead, she pleaded exhaustion, which was entirely truthful, and retired to the small room she'd been given, alone for the first time in weeks, surrounded by the unfamiliar comfort of a proper bed and 4 solid walls. Becca found herself overwhelmed by grief. The weight of all she had lost, Samuel, their dreams, their future, crashed down upon her. She wept silently into the pillow, mourning not just her husband, but the woman she had been, the naive girl who believed the West held nothing but promise. Morning brought a knock at her door. Lieutenant James Harrington, a fresh-faced young officer with earnest blue eyes, had been assigned as her escort while she remained at the fort. "Colonel Fletcher asked me to assist you in filing a formal report about the attack," he explained as they walked toward the headquarters building. "And there's someone who wishes to speak with you, a U.S. Marshal investigating outlaw activity." "In the territory," Becca nodded, straightening her borrowed dress, one of Mrs. Peterson's, hastily altered to fit her smaller frame. "And Makya, the Lakota scout who came with me?" "Still in the interpreter's quarters," Harrington replied. "He's been speaking with our chief scout. Seems they're distant kin of some sort." The morning passed in a blur of questions and statements. Becca recounted her story multiple times, to the clerk recording her formal statement, to Lieutenant Harrington, and finally to Marshal Robert Grant, a weathered man with a silver star pinned to his buckskin vest. The marshal listened with uncommon attentiveness, asking pointed questions about the outlaws, their number, appearance, weapons, anything that might help identify them. "The one who shot me," Becca recalled, had a distinctive scar along his jawline, and their leader wore a red bandana with white markings, different from the others. Grant's eyes narrowed. "Matches the description of Bill Stockton's gang. They've been preying on wagon trains from South Pass to Fort Hall for the past year." "You know who they are?" Becca asked, leaning forward. "Why haven't they been caught?" The marshal's expression hardened. "Territory's vast, ma'am. Few lawmen, many places to hide, and it's been convenient for some to blame Indian raids rather than admit white men could do such things." "Convenient for whom?" Becca pressed. Grant exchanged a glance with Lieutenant Harrington. "That's what I aim to find out." As they concluded the interview, Becca made her request. "I'd like to see Makya now." Harrington hesitated. "I'm not sure that's appropriate, Mrs. Morgan. There are protocols." "Lieutenant," Marshal Grant interrupted, "I suspect Mrs. Morgan has seen enough of the world's ugliness that propriety seems a small concern. Besides," he added with a pointed look, "we owe that man our gratitude." Reluctantly, Harrington led them to the interpreter's quarters, a long, low building near the eastern wall of the fort. Inside, they found Makya seated with an older native man, deep in conversation in the Lakota language. Makya rose as they entered, his expression brightening slightly at the sight of Becca. The older man remained seated, studying the newcomers with sharp eyes. "This is Windrunner," Makya explained, "scout for Blue Coat's many winters, my mother's cousin's husband." Windrunner nodded but did not speak. His silence carried its own eloquence, decades of suspicion earned through experience. "The Colonel has granted permission for Makya to remain until you've recovered your strength," Harrington informed Becca. "He's free to move about the fort during daylight hours, though he's asked not to leave without escort." In other words, Becca realized he was a guest in name, but a prisoner in practice. She glanced at Makya, who showed no reaction to these conditions. He had expected nothing better. "There's more," Marshal Grant said, his voice dropping. "I've been tracking Stockton's gang for months. If your description is accurate, they're headed north toward the gold fields. I'm leaving tomorrow to pursue them." Becca's heart quickened. "I want to go with you." Her declaration drew startled looks from both Harrington and the Marshal. Only Makya seemed unsurprised. "Mrs. Morgan," Harrington began. "That's simply not possible. The danger alone." "They murdered my husband," Becca cut in, her voice steady. "They murdered everyone I traveled with, everyone who shared our dreams. They left me for dead. I will see justice done." Marshal Grant studied her thoughtfully. "It won't bring him back," he said gently. "I know that," Becca replied, "but it might help me find a way forward." The Marshal exchanged glances with Windrunner, an unspoken communication passing between them. "I could use someone who can identify them with certainty," he admitted, "but the Colonel would never approve a civilian woman joining such an expedition." "Then don't tell him," Makya spoke suddenly. "I go too, know these lands, help track." Windrunner nodded slowly, finally speaking in heavily accented English. "Lakota eyes see what white eyes miss. Makya good tracker, better than me now." A plan began to take shape. Becca would ostensibly leave the fort with a supply wagon bound for a nearby settlement, then rendezvous with the Marshal's posse once they were beyond the fort's oversight. Makya would slip away during the night, using Windrunner's knowledge of the fort's routines to avoid the sentries. "This is highly irregular," Harrington protested, though with diminishing conviction. "If the Colonel found out..." "Sometimes justice requires irregular methods, Lieutenant," Marshal Grant replied. "The question is, will you help us or hinder us?" The young officer looked conflicted, his sense of duty warring with his sense of right. Finally, he sighed. "I'll arrange the supply wagon, but if asked directly, I cannot lie to my commanding officer." "Fair enough," Grant agreed. "We'll be gone before any such questions arise." That night, as Becca prepared for bed in her small room at the Petersons' quarters, she found herself filled with a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a dangerous journey, one that might end in justice or further tragedy. A soft knock at her window startled her. Pulling aside the thin curtain, she found Makya's face peering in, his expression urgent. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, opening the window. "If you're caught..." "Must speak," he interrupted. "Not safe for you." Marshal Grant, not trusted by all. Becca frowned. "What do you mean?" "Windrunner hears soldiers talk. Some protect outlaws, take gold from them, maybe even here in Fort." The implication chilled Becca to the bone. If corruption reached into Fort Bridger itself, their plan might be compromised before it began. "Do you know who?" she asked. Makya shook his head. "Only whispers. Be careful who you trust. Morning comes soon. I go now." Before she could respond, he disappeared into the darkness as silently as he had come. Sleep proved elusive that night. Becca's mind raced with questions and fears. Who within the fort might be collaborating with the outlaws? Could it be Lieutenant Harrington himself, Colonel Fletcher, or some minor officer hoping to supplement his meager military pay? Dawn broke clear and cool, the fort coming to life with the familiar sounds of a military outpost, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the cadence of the morning drill, the murmur of voices as soldiers and civilians began their day. Mrs. Peterson helped Becca pack the few belongings she had accumulated during her short stay: a change of clothes, a small sewing kit, the pouch of medicinal herbs from Wachiwi. To these, Becca added an unexpected gift from the colonel's wife, a small pistol easily concealed in a pocket or sleeve. A woman alone should never be defenseless, Mrs. Fletcher had told her when presenting the weapon. My father taught me to shoot when I was 12. I've never regretted the skill. The supply wagon was scheduled to depart at mid-morning. Lieutenant Harrington arrived to escort Becca to the main gate, his manner formal, but his eyes troubled. I still believe this is a mistake, he said quietly as they walked. Marshal Grant is a capable lawman, but the territory is lawless, and your Lakota friend, his presence may complicate matters further. Makya has proven his worth many times over, Becca replied. I trust him with my life. Harrington's expression softened slightly. I see that you do. It's unusual that trust between your people and his. Perhaps it shouldn't be, Becca suggested. Perhaps that's the real mistake we've been making all along. The lieutenant had no response to that. The supply wagon waited at the gate, a sturdy vehicle laden with provisions for a settlement 15 miles east. The driver, a grizzled veteran, named Cooper, barely acknowledged Becca as she climbed aboard. He had been briefed on the plan, but clearly disapproved of involving a woman in such business. As the wagon rumbled through the fort's gate and onto the rutted trail beyond, Becca felt a curious sense of liberation. The walls of Fort Bridger had offered safety, but also confinement of body and thought. Out here, despite the dangers, she could breathe freely again. They traveled for several hours, the landscape rolling past in shades of green and gold. Spring was yielding to early summer, wildflowers dotting the prairie in splashes of color. Under different circumstances, Becca might have found beauty in the scene. At a fork in the trail, Cooper drew the wagon to a halt. Marshals meeting. Point is 2 miles yonder, he said, pointing to a stand of cottonwoods in the distance. I go east from here. You sure about this, ma'am? Becca nodded, gathering her small bundle of belongings. Quite sure, Mr. Cooper. Thank you for your assistance. The driver grunted, clearly washing his hands of any responsibility for her fate. Good luck to you, then. You'll need it. She set off toward the cottonwoods, her heart pounding with each step. The pistol Mrs. Fletcher had given her pressed reassuringly against her side, concealed in the pocket of her dress. If Makya's warnings proved accurate, she might need it sooner than expected. The grove of trees appeared deserted when she arrived, their leaves rustling softly in the afternoon breeze. Becca hesitated at the edge, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Hello? She called cautiously. Marshal Grant? Silence answered her. Had she misunderstood the rendezvous point, or had something gone wrong? A twig snapped behind her. Becca whirled, her hand going instinctively to the hidden pistol. A figure emerged from behind a massive cottonwood. Makya, his expression grim. Where is the marshal? She asked, relieved to see a friendly face, but alarmed by his demeanor. Not here, Makya replied. No one here when I arrive. Wait, watch, listen. He gestured for her to follow him deeper into the grove, where the trees grew more densely. Something wrong. Feel it. Becca had learned to trust Makya's instincts. If he sensed danger, it was real. What should we do? Before he could answer, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats reached them. Through the trees, they glimpsed a group of riders approaching from the direction of Fort Bridger, at least 6 men, moving at a gallop. Hide! Makya urged, pulling her behind a fallen tree trunk. Not make sense! Marshal brings so many men! They crouched in silence as the riders entered the grove, their voices carrying clearly in the still air. Spread out, a familiar voice ordered. She has to be here somewhere. The Indian, too. Lieutenant Harrington. Becca's blood ran cold. The young officer's reluctance had been more than military propriety. It had been the hesitation of a man contemplating betrayal. Makya's eyes met hers, confirming her suspicions. We go, he whispered. Now stay low. They crawled through the underbrush, using the dense foliage as cover, while Harrington's men dismounted and began searching the grove. The fallen tree provided concealment, but they couldn't remain hidden for long. There! A shout went up as one of the soldiers spotted movement. By the big cottonwood! Gunfire erupted, bullets thudding into tree trunks and kicking up dirt. Becca and Makya abandoned stealth for speed, running in a crouch toward the edge of the grove. The trees thinned ahead, offering less cover but a clear path to the open prairie beyond. Stop, or we'll shoot to kill, Harrington's voice commanded. Becca glanced back to see the lieutenant himself pursuing them, rifle in hand. The young man's face was twisted with determination. Or was it desperation? They burst from the tree line onto open ground, immediately exposed and vulnerable. 50 yards ahead, the land dropped away into a shallow ravine, their only hope for cover. More gunshots rang out. Makya stumbled, clutching his side, but kept running. Becca saw the dark stains spreading across his buckskin shirt and felt a surge of fury. She drew the small pistol from her pocket, turned and fired in one fluid motion. The shot went wide, but it was enough to make Harrington and his men dive for cover, buying precious seconds. Becca and Makya half ran, half fell into the ravine, using its banks as shelter from the gunfire. You're hit, Becca gasped, reaching for Makya's wound. Keep moving, he grunted. Not deep. Bullet passed through. They followed the ravine as it deepened and widened, eventually opening into a broader gully dotted with boulders and scrub brush. Behind them, they could hear Harrington organizing his men to continue the pursuit. Why? Becca panted as they ran. Why is he doing this? Gold, Makya replied grimly. Always gold. White man's disease. They pushed on, the terrain growing increasingly rugged. Makya's wound slowed him, but his knowledge of the land proved invaluable. He led them through passages too narrow for horses, forcing their pursuers to dismount and follow on foot, losing precious time. As dusk approached, they found temporary shelter in a natural hollow beneath an overhanging rock. Concealed by brush and shadow, they paused to catch their breath and assess their situation. Let me see your wound, Becca insisted, her voice allowing no argument. Makya reluctantly lifted his shirt, revealing an angry furrow along his ribs. Where the bullet had grazed him, the bleeding had slowed but not stopped entirely. Using water from her canteen and strips torn from her petticoat, Becca cleaned and bandaged the injury as best she could. We need to find Marshal Grant, she said, sitting back on her heels. If he's truly investigating the outlaws, he needs to know about Harrington. If still alive, Makya replied soberly, maybe Marshal already dead. Ambush like us. The possibility hung between them, dark and disturbing. If Grant had been eliminated, who else could they turn to? The Colonel? How far did the corruption extend? What about your people? Becca asked. Could we reach them? Makya considered this. 3 days' journey, if strong, but dangerous now. Soldiers call us hostiles, hunt us. Night fell completely, cloaking the landscape in darkness. In the distance, they could hear Harrington's men still searching, their voices carrying on the evening air. They would need to move again soon, using the cover of darkness to put more distance between themselves and their pursuers. Rest now, Makya advised. Move when moon sets. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded Becca, her mind spun with questions and fears. Had Harrington been corrupt from the beginning, or had he been coerced somehow? Was Marshal Grant dead or alive? And most pressing of all, how would they survive long enough to expose the truth? Beside her, Makya maintained a vigilant watch, his breathing steady despite his injury. His resilience humbled her. When he had found her among the dead at Devil's Gate, she had been little more than a broken shell, physically and spiritually. Now, against all odds, they had formed a bond that transcended the hostilities between their peoples. "Makya," she whispered after a long silence, "thank you for everything." He turned to look at her, his expression softening in the dim light. "No thanks needed. You fight for truth. I fight with you." The simple statement carried the weight of a solemn vow. The moon began its descent, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain. Makya touched Becca's arm lightly. "Time to go." They moved silently through the darkness, Makya leading the way with an uncanny ability to navigate by the stars and the feel of the land beneath his feet. Becca followed closely, her senses heightened by fear and determination. Their plan, such as it was, involved circling back toward Fort Bridger while avoiding the search parties. If Marshal Grant was still alive, he might return to the fort when they failed to appear at the rendezvous. If not, they would need to find a way to approach Colonel Fletcher directly, bypassing Harrington and any other corrupted officers. Dawn found them crouched behind a rocky outcropping, surveying the land below. In the distance, they could see riders moving in a search pattern. Harrington's men still hunting them. "They not give up," Makya observed. "We important to them, because we know the truth," Becca replied, "about the outlaws, about the corruption." They retreated to a small cave Makya had discovered, barely more than a crack in the rocky hillside, but deep enough to conceal them during daylight hours. Inside, they shared the meager provisions Becca had brought: jerky, hardtack, and a handful of dried berries. As Makya kept watch at the narrow entrance, Becca checked his wound again. The bleeding had stopped, but angry red streaks had begun to spread outward from the injury, the beginning of infection. "We need medicine," she said, her medical knowledge from both her father and Wachiwi telling her what would happen without proper treatment. "And clean water." Makya nodded, his face betraying no pain, though she knew he must be suffering. "Stream 2 miles west. Plants there for fever." Becca frowned. "You shouldn't travel. The infection will spread faster with movement." "Can't stay," he replied simply. "They find us soon." He was right, and they both knew it. Harrington's men were methodically searching the area, gradually closing in on their location. By nightfall, they would need to move again, regardless of Makya's condition. Survival demanded uncomfortable choices. As the day wore on, they took turns keeping watch while the other rested. The cave grew hot as the sun rose higher, the air inside becoming stifling. Becca dozed fitfully, her dreams haunted by images of the massacre, of Samuel's lifeless eyes, of Harrington's face twisted with malice. She woke to Makya's hand on her shoulder, his expression alert. "Riders coming," he whispered. "Close." Becca scrambled to the cave entrance, peering out through the narrow opening. 3 soldiers were approaching from the east, their horses, picking their way carefully through the rocky terrain. They had not seen the cave yet, but their path would bring them directly to it. "We need a distraction," Becca whispered, her mind racing, "something to draw them away." Makya's eyes fell on a loose pile of rocks near the cave entrance. With careful movements, he shifted position and extended his leg, pushing several stones over the edge of the slope. They clattered down the incline, raising a small cloud of dust. The soldiers immediately turned toward the disturbance, suspicion evident in their posture. "Over there," one called, pointing to the rock fall. "Spread out!" As they dismounted and began to climb the slope, Makya motioned for Becca to move deeper into the cave, where a narrow fissure led further into the hillside. The passage was barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, forcing them to inch along sideways. pressed against the rough stone. Behind them, they could hear the soldiers discovering the cave entrance. "Footprints," a voice called. "There, in here." The fissure twisted and turned, occasionally widening enough for them to move more freely before narrowing again. Daylight gradually faded as they pushed deeper into the hillside, the darkness becoming absolute. "Keep hand on wall," Makya instructed softly. "Feel way forward." They moved slowly, guided only by touch and instinct. Becca fought down rising panic as the walls seemed to press in around her, the air growing thinner with each step. She had never experienced such complete darkness, such utter isolation from the world above. Behind them, the soldiers had entered the cave but seemed hesitant to follow into the narrow passage. Their voices grew fainter as Becca and Makya continued their blind journey through the earth. After what felt like an eternity, Makya halted. "Air change," he whispered. "Feel it?" Becca paused, focusing on her senses. Yes. There was a subtle shift in the air, a freshness that hadn't been present before. And now that they had stopped moving, she could hear a sound. Water flowing somewhere ahead. "Another way out?" she asked hopefully. "Maybe," Makya replied. "Follow sound." The passage began to widen, the ceiling rising above them. Though still cloaked in darkness, the sense of claustrophobic confinement eased. The sound of water grew, louder, not the gentle babbling of a stream, but the more substantial rush of a larger flow. Suddenly, a faint illumination appeared ahead, not daylight, but a different quality of darkness, slightly less absolute. They moved toward it cautiously, the passage opening further with each step. Without warning, the ground dropped away beneath them. Becca gasped as she lost her footing, sliding down a steep incline of loose stone and earth. Makya grunted in pain beside her as they tumbled downward, unable to halt their descent in the darkness. They came to rest at the bottom of the slope, bruised and disoriented but intact. The sound of water was much louder now, almost deafening in the enclosed space. As Becca's eyes adjusted, she realized they were in a substantial cavern, dimly illuminated by a crack in the ceiling far above. Through this natural skylight, a thin shaft of daylight penetrated, revealing their surroundings. An underground river flowed through the cavern, its dark waters churning and frothing as it disappeared into a tunnel at the far end. The walls glistened with moisture, adorned with stalactites that had formed over countless centuries. "Where are we?" Becca whispered, her voice barely audible over the rush of water. "Old Lakota stories tell of rivers under mountains," Makya replied, wincing as he stood. His wound had reopened during their fall, fresh blood staining his bandage. "Spirit roads," elders call them. They followed the river's edge, careful of the slippery stone beneath their feet. The cavern extended further than the limited light revealed, its true dimensions hidden in shadow. The air was cold and damp, raising goosebumps on Becca's skin. "Look," Makya said suddenly, pointing to the far wall where the river entered the cavern. Becca squinted, making out a narrow ledge running alongside the water's edge, disappearing into another tunnel. "A path?" she asked. Makya nodded. "Water finds way out. We follow." The ledge proved treacherous, barely wide enough for single file, slicked with spray from the rushing river. They inched along it carefully, using the rough wall for balance. Makya insisted Becca go first, his hand steady at her back when the footing became particularly precarious. The tunnel curved gently, following the river's course. For a time, they were in complete darkness again, guided only by the feel of the wall and the sound of the water. Then gradually, a glow appeared ahead, faint at first, then growing stronger. Daylight. They emerged onto a rocky bank as the river flowed from the mountainside into a secluded valley. The late afternoon sun bathed the landscape in golden light, revealing a hidden sanctuary surrounded by steep cliffs. A meadow spread before them, dotted with wildflowers and sheltered by stands of aspen and pine. Beautiful, Becca breathed, momentarily forgetting their peril in the face of such unexpected splendor. Makya nodded, though his expression remained vigilant. Good place to rest, heal, then continue. They made their way to a cluster of boulders that offered some shelter while maintaining a view of the cave entrance they had emerged from. If the soldiers somehow followed their path through the mountain, they would be prepared. Using the last of their water, Becca cleaned Makya's wound again. The infection had worsened, the skin hot and angry around the bullet's path. Without proper medicine, gangrene was a real possibility. "I need to find herbs," she said, surveying the meadow. "Something for the infection." Makya's knowledge of plant medicine complemented her own. Together, they identified several promising specimens growing among the rocks and near the river's edge. Yarrow for bleeding, willow bark for pain and fever, a type of moss that could absorb infection when applied as a poultice. As Becca gathered these natural remedies, a movement at the valley's edge caught her attention. She froze, expecting soldiers or worse. Instead, a magnificent elk emerged from the tree line, pausing to survey the meadow before moving toward the river to drink. The animal's presence suggested they were far from human habitation, a momentary reprieve from pursuit. Becca returned to Makya with her botanical harvest, setting to work preparing the treatments Wachiwi had taught her. "We safe here for night," Makya said, as she applied the fresh poultice to his wound. "Tomorrow must decide. Fort Bridger too dangerous now?" Becca nodded, her mind working through their limited options. "What about your people? Could we reach them?" "Possible," Makya replied. 3 days north, but army patrols look for Lakota, always. Dangerous for my people if led soldiers there." An idea began to form in Becca's mind. A dangerous one, but perhaps their only chance for justice. What about the outlaw camp? If we could find them, find evidence linking them to Harrington and others at the fort. Makya studied her face, his expression serious. "Very dangerous, but..." He paused, considering. "Windrunner say Stockton's men camp near Medicine Mountain, not far from here." The sun began its descent behind the western cliffs, casting long shadows across their secluded valley. As darkness fell, Becca and Makya took shelter beneath an overhanging rock, building a small, smokeless fire for warmth. They spoke in hushed tones, formulating a plan that could easily cost them their lives. Find the outlaw camp, gather evidence, return not to Fort Bridger, but to the nearest territorial governor's representative, bypassing the corrupted chain of command entirely. It was a desperate strategy, born of limited options. But as Becca drifted into uneasy sleep, Samuel's face appeared in her dreams, not the lifeless mask she had last seen, but alive, encouraging, believing in her. Somewhere along this dangerous path, she had found purpose beyond mere survival. Justice would not bring him back, but it might give meaning to his loss. And perhaps in that meaning, she could find a way forward in this harsh new world. Dawn broke over the hidden valley, painting the sky in strokes of pink and gold. Becca woke to the sound of birdsong, momentarily disoriented before the events of the previous day came rushing back. She sat up, wincing at her stiff muscles, and found Makya already awake, tending the small fire. "How's your wound?" she asked, noting the fresh poultice he had applied. "Better," he replied, though the lines of pain around his eyes told a different story. "Fever less now." Becca moved to check his injury, her fingers gentle but thorough as she probed the area around the bullet's path. The angry red streaks had receded somewhat, but infection still lurked beneath the surface. "We need to stay another day," she said, firmly. "Let the herbs work longer before we travel." Makya started to protest, then nodded reluctantly. His face, normally impassive, showed a flicker of vulnerability. "You good healer, like Wachiwi." The comparison to the Lakota medicine woman warmed Becca unexpectedly. I learned from watching my father and from your people. Different knowledge, same purpose. They spent the day recovering their strength and preparing for the journey ahead. Becca explored the valley, discovering a wealth of useful plants and a small pool fed by a stream where they could bathe and refill their water skins. Makya, despite her insistence that he rest, set about crafting a bow from a flexible sapling and arrows from straight branches, using sinew from his clothing for bowstrings. For hunting, he explained, need food for journey. By afternoon, he had succeeded in bringing down a rabbit, which they roasted over their fire. The fresh meat restored some color to Makya's face, and Becca felt her own strength returning after days of meager rations. As twilight approached, they discussed their plan for reaching Medicine Mountain, where Makya believed Stockton's gang had established their camp. 2 days' travel, he said, sketching a rough map in the dirt with a stick. Through here, he indicated a winding path between hill symbols. Avoid soldiers, reach here. His stick tapped a distinctive peak. And then, Becca asked, watch, listen, learn names, faces, find proof of soldiers working with outlaws. The simplicity of the plan belied its danger. If discovered by either the outlaws or Harrington's men, they would face immediate execution. Becca fingered the small pistol in her pocket, 6 bullets against what might be dozens of armed men. Tomorrow we leave at first light, she decided. Your wound should be strong enough by then. That night, as they sat beside the fire, Becca found herself studying Makya's profile in the flickering light. The proud line of his nose, the determined set of his jaw, the intelligence in his dark eyes. He was unlike any man she had known, including Samuel. The thought brought a pang of guilt. Was it disloyal to notice another man's qualities so soon after losing her husband? But Makya had saved her life, had risked his own repeatedly for her sake. Gratitude and admiration were natural responses, she told herself, nothing more. What will you do? Makya asked suddenly, breaking the silence. After justice? The question caught Becca off guard. She had been so focused on survival and vengeance that she had given little thought to what might come afterward. I don't know, she admitted. I have no family left, no home. Could go to Oregon, Makya suggested. Like first plan. Becca shook her head. That was Samuel's dream more than mine. I followed because he was my husband. She stared into the flames. Maybe I'll find work as a healer somewhere. My father taught me enough to be useful. Could stay with Lakota, Makya said quietly. Watch we grow old. Need someone learn her ways. The suggestion startled Becca. Live among the Lakota? It seemed impossible. A white woman adopting the ways of a people most settlers considered savages. Yet hadn't she already begun that journey in the weeks since her rescue? Your people would never accept me, she said doubtfully. Makya's eyes met hers across the fire. Some would not, like white people with me. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Always those who fear what different? The conversation lingered in Becca's mind as she drifted into sleep that night. A new life among the Lakota, learning their medicine, their language, their ways. It was a possibility she had never imagined, yet one that held a strange appeal. Among her own people, she would always be the widow Morgan, an object of pity. Among the Lakota, she might forge a new identity, one built on strength rather than loss. Morning brought clarity and purpose. They broke camp efficiently, leaving little trace of their presence in the hidden valley. Makya's strength had improved considerably, though Becca insisted on checking his wound one last time before they departed. The infection was receding, the angry redness fading to a healthier pink. Your medicine's strong, he acknowledged as she replaced the bandage with fresh herbs. Make good Lakota healer someday. They set out as the sun crested the eastern ridge, following a game trail that wound through the rocky terrain. Makya led the way, moving with the silent grace that had first impressed Becca during their journey to Fort Bridger. She followed, alert for any sign of pursuit. The day grew hot as they traversed the wilderness, avoiding the main trails where soldiers might patrol. Makya's knowledge of the land proved invaluable. He found water where none was visible, game, trails that offered easier passage, vantage points from which to survey the surrounding territory for threats. By midday, they had covered considerable ground, the hidden valley far behind them. Ahead, the terrain grew increasingly rugged, forcing them to pick their way carefully through boulder-strewn slopes and dense stands of pine. "Makya," Becca asked during a brief rest, "how did you become a scout for your people, I mean?" He took a drink from his water skin before answering. "My father, great warrior, teach me track, hunt, listen to land since boy." His expression grew, distant. "When 15 summers, go on first vision quest. Spirit guide, show me path, to be eyes for my people." "Vision quest?" Becca inquired, intrigued. "Time alone in wilderness, no food, little water, wait for spirits to speak?" He glanced at her curiously. "White people have such thing?" Becca thought of the revival meetings she had attended in Ohio, where preachers spoke of divine revelation. "Some do. Different ways, but similar purpose, perhaps." Makya nodded thoughtfully. "Many paths to same mountain." They continued their journey through the afternoon, the landscape gradually changing as they moved northward. The scattered pines gave way to denser forest, offering better concealment but slower progress. By evening, they had reached a ridgeline that offered a commanding view of the surrounding territory. "There," Makya said, pointing to a distant peak silhouetted against the sunset. "Medicine Mountain, one more day." They made camp in a small clearing, building a fire small enough to provide warmth without risking detection by distant observers. Becca's muscles ached from the day's exertion, but her spirit felt stronger than it had since the massacre. Purpose had replaced despair. Action had supplanted grief, at least temporarily. As darkness fell, a haunting howl echoed across the hills, a wolf calling to its pack. Becca shivered involuntarily. "No fear," Makya said, noticing her reaction. "Wolf spirit, powerful ally. Teach loyalty, family strength." "Your people don't." "Fear wolves?" Becca asked, drawing her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Respect, not fear," he corrected. "Wolf teaches much. Hunter, protector, family maker." He gazed into the darkness beyond their small fire. "My vision quest, wolf came. Show me way." Becca tried to imagine it, a young Makya alone in the wilderness, communing with animal spirits, finding his path in life through such profound solitude. It seemed both alien and somehow deeply familiar, resonating with something in her own soul that longed for meaningful connection. "What did the wolf show you?" she asked softly. Makya was silent for a long moment. "Show me two worlds meeting," he finally replied. "One old, one new. Show me standing between, seeing both." The significance of his vision struck Becca forcefully. Makya lived between worlds, understanding both the Lakota ways and those of the white settlers, able to navigate the perilous boundaries between these colliding cultures. Much like she herself was beginning to do. They set out at first light, traveling through increasingly dense forest as they approached Medicine Mountain. Makya moved with heightened caution now, frequently stopping to study the ground for tracks or listen for distant sounds. "Others been here," he said, kneeling to examine broken twigs and disturbed earth. "Many horses, men with heavy boots." He pointed to a distinctive print. Soldier boots, different from settler boots. Becca felt a chill of apprehension. Harrington's men? Maybe. Makya stood, his expression troubled. Tracks go same way we go, toward mountain. They proceeded with even greater caution, Makya leading them on a parallel path that avoided the main trail while maintaining their direction toward Medicine Mountain. By midday, the distinctive peak loomed closer, its slopes covered in pine forest with a rocky summit jutting skyward. "We close now," Makya whispered as they paused to rest in a dense thicket. "Outlaw camp near base of mountain. Must move quiet like deer." They left their small packs concealed beneath a fallen log, taking only weapons and water. Becca checked that the small pistol was loaded and accessible in her pocket. 6 bullets, a meager defense, but better than nothing. Moving in near silence, they crept through the forest, using every available cover. Makya's senses seemed supernaturally attuned to their surroundings, his head turning at the slightest sound, his nostrils flaring to catch scents carried on the breeze. The first indication that they were nearing the outlaw camp came in the form of smoke, a thin tendril rising above the tree line ahead. Makya gestured for Becca to stay low as they approached a rocky outcropping that offered a vantage point. Carefully, they crawled to the edge, peering down into a natural basin sheltered by the mountain's lower slopes. What they saw confirmed their suspicions and raised new alarms. The outlaw camp spread before them, a collection of crude shelters and tents arranged around a central fire pit. Horses were corralled in a makeshift pen, their number suggesting at least 15 to 20 men. But it was the sight of blue uniforms among the rough-clad outlaws that sent a chill through Becca's blood. Soldiers, not just Harrington's men, but others, including officers whose insignia reflected higher rank. 5 soldiers, Makya whispered, his keen eyes picking out details Becca missed. 1 captain, others lower. "Can you see Harrington?" Becca asked, scanning the figures below. Makya shook his head. "Not see yet. Wait." They observed in silence as the camp went about its business. Men cleaned weapons, tended horses, drank from bottles passed around the fire. The atmosphere was one of rough camaraderie, outlaws and soldiers alike sharing the easy fellowship of men engaged in profitable criminal enterprise. After nearly an hour of observation, a new group of riders approached the camp, 3 men on horseback, led by a figure Becca recognized with a surge of hatred. "Harrington," she hissed. The lieutenant and his companions were greeted warmly, dismounting to join the others around the fire. A large man with a prominent scar along his jawline emerged from the largest tent, embracing Harrington like a brother. "Stockton," Makya identified quietly, outlaw leader. They watched as Harrington and Stockton conversed, their manner suggesting a well-established relationship. Sacks changed hands, payment or profit sharing from their criminal enterprise. "We need to get closer," Becca whispered. "Hear what they're saying." Makya considered this, then nodded reluctantly. "Dangerous, but need proof." He studied the layout of the camp, considering approaches. There, he pointed to a dense stand of pine that extended almost to the edge of the clearing. "Can get closer, but very dangerous." Moving with agonizing slowness, they backed away from the outcropping and circled through the forest, approaching the camp from a different angle. The afternoon sun had begun its descent, lengthening shadows that offered additional concealment as they crept toward the stand of pines Makya had identified. The voices grew clearer as they reached the edge of the forest, hidden among the lowest branches of the pine trees. From this position, they could see the main fire pit clearly and hear the conversation taking place around it. "Governors. Man asking too many questions," Harrington was saying, his voice carrying on the still air. "Grant's disappearance has them suspicious." Stockton spat into the fire. "Grant was a problem from the start. Should have taken care of him months ago." "Well, he's not a problem anymore," an older officer, a major by his insignia, interjected. "The question is whether his reports reached Denver before we intercepted him." Becca and Makya exchanged glances. Marshal Grant had been killed, just as they had feared. "What about the woman?" Stockton asked, taking a swig from a bottle. The one who survived Devil's Gate. Becca froze at the mention, straining to hear Harrington's response. Still searching, the lieutenant admitted, his expression darker now. She and that Lakota scout gave us the slip, but they can't have gone far, not with the scout wounded. Find them, Stockton ordered, his scarred face twisted in a scowl. The woman can identify us from the attack, and that Indian, he's seen too much now. We've got patrols covering every trail between here and Fort Bridger, Harrington assured. Him. They'll turn up. Make sure they turn up dead, the major added coldly. We can't afford complications with the next shipment coming through. The conversation shifted to details of their operation. Gold shipments from territorial mines diverted before reaching their official destinations. Wagon trains targeted for their valuables. The network of corrupt officials who ensured investigations led nowhere. Becca felt sick listening to the casual way they discussed murder and theft. These were the men responsible for the slaughter of her husband and friends, men who wore the uniform of the United States Army alongside the rougher garb of outlaws. A sudden commotion from the far side of the camp drew everyone's attention. A rider approached at a gallop, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. Patrol's back, someone called. The new arrival dismounted in a cloud of dust, hurrying to Stockton and Harrington with urgency in his bearing. His voice was too low to hear clearly, but his animated gestures suggested important news. Stockton's reaction was immediate and alarming. He barked orders, men scrambling to comply. Harrington conferred briefly with the other officers, then mounted his horse alongside Stockton. They found something, Makya whispered. Maybe our trail. Indeed, within minutes, a group of 10 men, a mixture of soldiers and outlaws, had mounted and were preparing to ride out, Stockton and Harrington at their head. We need to go, Becca urged, already backing away from their hiding place. Now! They retreated into the deeper forest, moving as quickly as stealth allowed. The sun had begun to set, the forest darkening around them, making navigation more challenging but providing better cover. Back to our packs, Makya decided. Then, far from here, they hunt us now. They had covered perhaps half the distance to their hidden supplies when the sound of hoofbeats reached them, distant at first, then growing rapidly closer. The search party had picked up their trail with alarming speed. How did they find us? So quickly, Becca gasped as they ran. Dogs, Makya replied grimly. Hear them now. Indeed, the baying of hounds had joined the thunder of hooves. The outlaws had tracking dogs, likely kept for hunting game, but now set upon human quarry. They ran in earnest now, abandoning stealth for speed. The rocky terrain slowed their pursuers, somewhat, but the dogs would not be deterred for long. Twilight deepened around them, the forest transforming into a maze of shadows. There! Makya pointed to a narrow ravine cutting across their path. Water! Break trail! They slid down the steep bank into the shallow stream that ran through the ravine, immediately turning to follow its course downstream. The cold water numbed Becca's feet through her thin moccasins, but it would temporarily mask their scent from the tracking dogs. They waded for nearly half a mile before Makya gestured to an overhanging bank where tree roots created a natural ladder. They climbed from the stream, careful to leave minimal sign of their passage, and continued through the darkening forest. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter behind them, suggesting their water trick had succeeded in confusing the dogs, at least temporarily. But night was falling fast, making travel increasingly treacherous. Need shelter, Makya said, studying the deepening shadows. Night, hunting dangerous. Better hide, wait for dawn. They found a suitable spot beneath a cluster of fallen trees, their massive trunks creating a natural fortress. Crawling into the space between root and earth, they pulled branches to conceal the entrance to their improvised shelter. Inside, the space was cramped but secure, the smell of damp earth and decaying wood surrounding them. They sat close together, neither speaking as they listened for sounds of pursuit. Gradually, the forest settled into the rhythms of night, the hooting of owls, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, the whisper of wind through pine needles. "Think we lost them?" Becca finally whispered. "For now," Makya replied. "Dogs confused, night make tracking hard, but morning come, they try again." The reality of their situation settled heavily upon Becca's shoulders. They were being hunted by men who would show no mercy, men with resources, weapons, and the authority of their positions to shield them from consequences. "We need to get word to someone outside Fort Bridger," she said. "The territorial governor, perhaps." "Denver far," Makya reminded her. "Many days' journey. Need horses, supplies." An idea formed in Becca's mind. Desperate, dangerous, but perhaps their only option. "What if we went back?" Makya looked at her sharply. "Back to outlaw camp. Too dangerous." "Not to attack them," Becca clarified. "For horses, supplies, they're out searching for us. The camp will be less guarded." For a long moment, Makya said nothing, weighing the proposal against their limited alternatives. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Very dangerous, but maybe only way." They rested uneasily through the night, taking turns keeping watch at the entrance to their shelter. The sounds of pursuit faded entirely, suggesting the search had been called off until daylight. Small comfort, given the determination their enemies had already demonstrated. In the darkest hours before dawn, Becca found herself unable to sleep despite exhaustion. Her mind raced with thoughts of Samuel, of the life they had planned together, of the future that had been stolen from them. She had never imagined herself becoming this woman, hiding in the wilderness, plotting to steal horses from armed killers, forming an alliance with a Lakota scout. "You should rest," Makya whispered, noticing her wakefulness. "Need strength tomorrow." "I can't," she admitted. "Too many thoughts." He was silent for a moment, then spoke softly. "My people say dreams show true self, not what others see, not what we pretend, what lives in heart." "And what do your dreams show you?" Becca asked. Makya considered the question carefully. "Show me standing between worlds, not fully in either, seeing both." He paused. "What your dreams show?" Becca closed her eyes, considering. "Lately they show me becoming someone I never thought I would be. Someone stronger, perhaps, or just different." "Not different," Makya corrected gently. "True self, coming out like flower after winter, was always there, waiting." His words resonated deeply, offering a perspective Becca hadn't considered. Perhaps this journey, painful as it had been, was revealing rather than changing her, stripping away the societal expectations that had shaped her life in Ohio and on the wagon train. "Thank you," she whispered, though for what precisely she couldn't have articulated. Makya seemed to understand nonetheless, nodding slightly in the darkness. First light found them preparing to enact their dangerous plan. They would circle back to the outlaw camp, observe until they were certain Stockton, Harrington, and most of the men were still away searching, then attempt to secure horses and supplies. "If separated," Makya instructed as they prepared to leave. "Their shelter, meet at Hidden Valley, wait 3 days, if other not come." He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. If either of them failed to appear after 3 days, the other should assume the worst and proceed alone. "I understand," Becca said, checking that the small pistol was secure in her pocket. "But we won't be separated." Makya's expression suggested he wished he could share her certainty. They moved through the early morning forest with renewed caution, alert for signs of searchers who might have remained in the area overnight. The air was cool and misty, visibility limited, but gradually improving as the sun rose higher. It took most of the morning to circle back to the vicinity of the outlaw camp, approaching from yet another direction to minimize the chance of encountering patrols. They paused frequently to listen and observe, Makya's keen senses alert for any hint of danger. By midday, they had reached a vantage point similar to their first observation post, allowing them to survey the camp from concealment. As they had hoped, the camp appeared significantly emptier than before. Perhaps half a dozen men remained, tending to basic tasks while the main force continued the search. 6 men, Makya counted softly. 2 by horses, 1 cooking, 3 by tents. Becca studied the layout, forming a strategy. If we wait until dark, could we reach the horses without being seen? Makya frowned thoughtfully. Maybe. Moon almost full tonight. Good for seeing, bad for hiding. They observed throughout the afternoon, noting the routines of the remaining men, the locations of sentries, the comings and goings. No large groups returned, suggesting Stockton and Harrington were still leading the main search party elsewhere. As twilight approached, bringing the cooler air of evening, they finalized their plan. They would wait until the camp settled, for the night then approached from the darkest side, where the corral backed against the forest. With luck, they could secure 2 horses and be gone before an alarm was raised. If caught, Makya said solemnly, fight hard. Better die fighting than what they do to prisoners. Becca nodded, her throat tight. She had seen enough of these men's handiwork at Devil's Gate to know the truth of his words. Darkness fell fully, the nearly full moon rising to cast silver light across the landscape. In the outlaw camp, activity diminished as men retired to tents or settled around the central fire with bottles of whiskey. One man took up position as night sentry, a rifle across his knees as he sat on an upturned crate at the edge of the camp. Now, Makya whispered after they had observed the night patterns for over an hour. Move like shadow. They descended from their hiding place, using the trees for cover as long as possible before crossing the open ground between forest and camp. Makya led the way, his movements fluid and silent despite his healing wound. Becca followed, placing her feet precisely where he had, careful to disturb nothing that might create noise. The sentry was positioned on the opposite side of the camp, his attention focused outward toward the main trail. The remaining men were gathered around the fire, their raucous laughter and drunken conversation providing additional cover for any small sounds Becca and Makya might make. They reached the edge of the horse corral without incident, crouching behind its crude fence. The animals shifted restlessly, sensing their presence but not alarmed enough to make noise. Makya studied the enclosure, identifying the gate and its simple latch. With infinite patience, he eased the gate open just enough for a single horse to pass through. Selecting a dark-colored gelding that stood somewhat apart from the others, he approached it slowly, whispering words in Lakota that seemed to calm the animal. Becca remained by the gate, her eyes constantly shifting between the sentry, the men, at the fire, and Makya with the horse. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared it might be heard across the clearing. Makya led the gelding to the gate, then gestured for Becca to enter the corral and select a mount for herself. She slipped inside, moving toward a smaller bay mare that had watched their activities with intelligent eyes. The mare allowed Becca to approach and stroke her neck, apparently accustomed to human handling. So far, their plan was unfolding perfectly. Perhaps too perfectly, a voice of caution whispered in Becca's mind. That caution proved prophetic moments later when a shout rang out from the direction of the fire. "Hey, the horses!" One of the drunken outlaws had risen to relieve himself and spotted movement by the corral. Instantly, the camp erupted into activity, men grabbing weapons and rushing toward them. "Go!" Makya urged, practically throwing Becca onto the bay mare's back and slapping the animal into motion. She clung desperately as the horse bolted through. The gate, Makya right behind her on the gelding. Gunfire erupted behind them, bullets whizzing past as they galloped toward the tree line. Becca kept her head low over the mare's neck, offering the smallest possible target. Makya rode beside her, guiding both horses toward the shelter of the forest. They crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at their faces as the horses plunged forward. Behind them, shouts and more gunfire indicated pursuit was being organized. They had perhaps minutes before mounted outlaws would be on their trail. "This way," Makya called, turning his mount onto a game trail that wound deeper into the forest. Becca followed, trusting his knowledge of the terrain over her own instincts. They rode hard through the darkness, the nearly full moon providing just enough light to avoid the worst obstacles. The horses, sensing the urgency of their riders, gave their all, hooves pounding the earth in a rhythmic drumbeat of escape. After what felt like hours but was likely less than one, Makya signaled for them to slow, listening intently for sounds of pursuit. The forest had grown thicker around them, the trail narrower, making fast travel increasingly hazardous. "Hear them?" Becca asked breathlessly, her body aching from the hard ride. Makya nodded grimly. "3, maybe 4 riders. Not give up easy." "What do we do?" He considered briefly, then pointed to a rocky slope rising to their right. "Up there. Horses leave clear tracks on soft ground, rocks hide trail." They urged their mounts up the slope, the animals struggling for footing on the loose shale. At the top, a ridge ran roughly eastward, its surface hard enough that horseshoes left minimal impression. Following the ridgeline for nearly a mile, they descended into a different valley, then forded a shallow stream, another tactic to confuse trackers. Throughout the night, they continued this pattern, alternating between hard riding and careful maneuvers designed to break their trail. By the time dawn lightened the eastern sky, they had put considerable distance between themselves and the outlaw camp. The sounds of pursuit had faded entirely, though whether they had truly lost their hunters or merely gained a temporary lead remained uncertain. They paused in a small clearing to rest the horses, which were lathered with sweat and breathing heavily from the night's exertions. Makya dismounted to check their mounts for injuries, while Becca surveyed the surrounding forest for immediate threats. "We did it," she said, finally allowing herself to acknowledge their partial success. "We have horses and supplies," Makya added, indicating the saddlebags on his gelding. A quick inventory revealed ammunition, jerky, a small sack of coffee, beans and various tools, likely the personal belongings of the horse's previous owner. But most valuable of all was a folded paper Makya discovered in an inner pocket of the saddlebag, a crude map showing the locations of recent attacks, supply routes, and what appeared to be a schedule of future targets. "Evidence," Becca breathed, examining the document. "This proves the connection between the soldiers and the outlaws." Makya nodded, his expression serious despite their success. "Now must decide. Where go? Fort still dangerous. Denver far." Becca studied the map thoughtfully, noting the locations marked for future attacks. One in particular caught her attention. A settlement called Pine Creek, apparently scheduled for a raid within the week. "Here," she said, pointing to the notation, "if we can warn these people, save them from what happened at Devil's Gate." She looked up at Makya, determination in her eyes. "And there might be a marshal, a sheriff, someone who could take this evidence to the proper authorities." Makya considered, then nodded slowly. 3 days' ride, dangerous country." "Everything we do is dangerous now," Becca replied with a grim smile. "But I won't let what happened to Samuel and the others happen again, not if I can prevent it." As the sun climbed higher, they mounted again and set off toward Pine Creek, their path carrying them further from Fort Bridger and deeper into territory unfamiliar to either of them. The map offered basic guidance, but much would depend on Makya's woodcraft and their shared determination. They rode with purpose now, no longer simply fleeing but moving toward a new objective, to warn the innocent, to bring evidence to light, to ensure justice found those who had believed themselves beyond its reach. For Becca, each mile strengthened her resolve. She was no longer just a survivor, but a messenger carrying truth that might save lives. The woman who had left Ohio as a dutiful wife had been transformed by grief and hardship into someone with her own mission, her own strengths. And riding beside her, Makya represented a partnership that defied the expected boundaries between their peoples. A shared commitment to justice that transcended the conflicts that divided settlers and Lakota. Together, they pressed onward toward Pine Creek, carrying warning and evidence through a wilderness where danger lurked at every turn. The journey had only become more perilous, but for the first time since the massacre, Becca felt something. Beyond grief and vengeance, a sense of purpose that might, in time, lead to healing. Pine Creek lay nestled in a valley between rolling hills, its collection of wooden buildings forming a rough rectangle along what passed for a main street. From their vantage point on a ridge overlooking the settlement, Becca and Makya observed the peaceful scene below, smoke rising from chimneys, horses hitched outside the general store, children playing near the schoolhouse. "Seems quiet," Becca remarked, shielding her eyes against the afternoon sun. "No sign of trouble yet." 3 days of hard riding had brought them to their destination, though not without difficulty. They had encountered a military patrol on the second day, forcing them to hide in a ravine for hours until the soldiers passed. Game had been scarce, leaving them subsisting primarily on the jerky they had stolen from the outlaw camp. Both horses and riders were exhausted, in need of proper rest and sustenance. "How do we approach?" Becca asked, studying the town's layout. "We can't simply ride in and announce that outlaws are coming." Makya considered the question. "I stay here," he decided. "You go alone. Town sees Indian, maybe not listen to warning." Becca frowned. "I won't leave you behind." "Not leaving," he corrected. "Watching. If trouble comes, better one outside to help." His logic was sound, if unfortunate. A Lakota warrior appearing in a frontier settlement would likely create panic, rather than cooperation, regardless of his intentions. The prejudice ran too deep. "Wait until dark," Makya continued. "Find person with authority. Marshal, sheriff. Show map, tell story." Becca nodded reluctantly. "I don't like splitting up." "Not like," Makya agreed with a hint of a smile. "But necessary." They retreated into the forest to wait for nightfall, tending to their horses and sharing the last of their provisions. As the sun began its descent, Becca found herself growing increasingly anxious about entering Pine Creek alone. "What if they don't believe me?" she wondered aloud. "I'm a woman traveling alone. They might think I'm mad." "Show map," Makya reminded her. "Names, places, plans, proof." Becca touched the folded document in her pocket. "And if that's not enough?" Makya's expression softened slightly. "Then return. We find another way." As darkness fell, they said their goodbyes at the edge of the forest. Makya would remain with the horses, watching for any sign of Stockton's gang approaching the town. Becca would enter Pine Creek, find the local law enforcement, and present their evidence. "Be careful," Makya said, his hand lingering on her arm. "You too," she replied, reluctant to leave despite the necessity. "I'll come back before dawn, regardless of what happens." Becca approached the town on foot, following the main road that led into Pine Creek from the east. A few buildings still showed lights in their windows, the saloon most prominently, its piano music and raucous laughter carrying on the night air. The street was mostly deserted at this hour, allowing Becca to move through town without drawing immediate attention. She sought a building that might serve as the local sheriff's office, finally spotting a small structure with a sign proclaiming "Marshal" hanging beside its door. A lamp burned inside, suggesting the lawman was still at his post, despite the late hour. Gathering her courage, Becca approached and knocked firmly on the door. "Come in," a gruff voice called. She entered to find a middle-aged man with a salt and pepper beard seated behind a worn desk, paperwork spread before him. A silver star gleamed on his vest, identifying him as Pine Creek's marshal. He looked up with surprise, clearly not expecting a woman visitor at this hour. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "I hope so," Becca replied, closing the door behind her. "My name is Rebecca Morgan. I have information about an imminent attack on your town." The marshal, whose nameplate identified him as J. Harper, frowned, studying her with skeptical eyes. "That's quite a statement, Mrs. Morgan. Perhaps you'd better sit down and explain." Becca took the offered chair, suddenly aware of how she must appear, travel-worn, exhausted, her clothing a strange mixture of settler and native garments. Hardly the picture of credibility. But as she began her story, the massacre at Devil's Gate, her rescue by the Lakota scouts, the corruption at Fort Bridger, the outlaw camp and their stolen evidence, Harper's expression gradually shifted from skepticism to concern. When she produced the map with Pine Creek clearly marked as a target, the marshal's face paled. "This is dated for 3 days from now," he noted, examining the document closely. "Yes," Becca confirmed. "We rode hard to reach you in time." Harper looked up sharply. "We?" Becca hesitated, unsure how much to reveal about Makya. "I had help getting here," she said carefully. "Someone who knows the territory." The marshal studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're Lakota. Friend, I'm guessing the one who found you after the massacre." Becca's surprise must have shown on her face, for Harper smiled grimly. 20 years in these territories teaches a man to read between lines, Mrs. Morgan, and that's a Lakota-style bandage on your wrist." She glanced down at the wrapping Makya had applied after she injured her wrist during their escape from the outlaw camp. "Yes," she admitted. "He's waiting outside town. We thought it best." "You thought right," Harper agreed. "Folks here are jumpy enough without a Lakota warrior riding in." He tapped the map thoughtfully. "This is serious business, Mrs. Morgan. Accusing army officers of collusion with outlaws, that's not something I can act on without solid proof." "The map isn't enough?" Becca asked, a note of desperation entering her voice. "It's something," Harper allowed, "but a piece of paper with scribbles won't convince a judge or protect me if I move against U.S. Army personnel without proper authority." Becca leaned forward intently. "Then what will you do? These men murdered an entire wagon train. They're planning to do the same here." The marshal rose, pacing the small office as he considered. "First thing is to prepare for the attack itself. I've got 8 deputies, good men, all of them. We can organize the townspeople, set up defenses." "And Lieutenant Harrington, Captain Hayes, the others involved?" Becca pressed. Harper stopped pacing, fixing her with a serious look. "There's a circuit judge due through here in 2 weeks. With your testimony and that map, we might convince him to issue warrants." He held up a hand as Becca began to protest. "I know. 2 weeks is too long when they're marked to attack in 3 days. But we do this by the book, or we're no better than they are." Disappointment washed over Becca. She had hoped for immediate action, for justice as swift as the violence that had been visited upon her husband and friends. "In the meantime," Harper continued, "you'll need a safe place to stay. There's a boarding house run by Widow Chen. She's discreet, won't ask questions." Becca shook her head. "I can't stay in town." Your friend should come in too," Harper interrupted. "I can arrange something quiet, keep you both out of sight until we deal with the immediate threat." The offer was tempting. Days of hard travel had left Becca exhausted, the prospect of a real bed and hot food nearly overwhelming. But something in Harper's manner gave her pause, a certain calculation behind his eyes that reminded her uncomfortably of Lieutenant Harrington's false courtesy. "I appreciate the offer, Marshal," she said carefully, but I should discuss it with my companion first. He's protective of his freedom." Harper's expression hardened slightly. "I'd hate to think you don't trust me, Mrs. Morgan." "It's not a question of trust," Becca replied, rising from her chair, "but recent experiences have taught me caution." The marshal studied her for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "As you wish. But my offer stands. Pine Creek looks after its own, and anyone willing to warn us of danger falls into that category." He copied the details from the stolen map onto a sheet of paper, then returned the original to Becca. "I'll keep this information to myself for now. No sense causing a panic until we're prepared. Come back tomorrow, and we'll discuss next steps." Becca left the marshal's office with mixed emotions. Harper had taken her warning seriously, which was more than she had dared hope. But his reluctance to pursue the corrupt officers immediately felt like a half measure at best. The town had grown quieter during her interview, most establishments closing for the night. Only the saloon remained fully animated, piano music and laughter spilling into the otherwise silent street. Becca walked purposefully toward the eastern edge of town, eager to rejoin Makya and share what she had learned. A movement in the shadows between buildings caught her attention, a figure ducking out of sight as she passed. Becca quickened her pace, her hand moving to the small pistol in her pocket. Had someone followed her from the marshal's office, or was it merely a drunk from the saloon taking a shortcut home? She had nearly reached the outskirts of Pine Creek when footsteps sounded behind her. Not one person, but several, moving quickly. Becca broke into a run, abandoning subtlety for speed. "Hold up there, Mrs. Morgan," a familiar voice called, Marshal Harper. Becca hesitated, then turned slowly to find the marshal approaching with two deputies flanking him. Their expressions were not reassuring. "Is something wrong, Marshal?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Harper's face was grim in the moonlight. "I'm afraid I need to detain you, ma'am, just until we sort a few things out." "Detain me?" Becca repeated incredulously. "On what grounds?" "Suspicion," Harper replied. "Telegraph came through yesterday. Warning about a woman matching your description, traveling with a Lakota. Wanted for questioning in connection with a murder at Fort Bridger." Becca's blood ran cold. Harrington had been thorough, using official channels to close off potential allies. "Murder? Whose murder?" "Marshal Robert Grant," Harper said, watching her reaction carefully. "Man you claimed was investigating the very corruption you're reporting." "That's absurd," Becca protested. "Grant was killed by the same people who attacked my wagon train, the people I'm trying to warn you about." Harper's expression revealed nothing. "Maybe so, but I can't ignore an official bulletin, especially one signed by a U.S. Army captain." Hayes. It had to be. The corrupt Captain Becca had seen conferring with Stockton at the outlaw camp. "The map," she said desperately. "The evidence. Could be genuine," Harper acknowledged, "or could be a clever distraction. Either way, my duty's clear. You'll be held safely until authorities from Fort Bridger arrive to sort this out." Becca's mind raced, calculating options. If she were detained, Makya would wait until dawn as planned, then approach the town looking for her. He would walk directly into a trap. "I'll come quietly," she said, making her decision, "but I need to get word to my friend. He shouldn't be punished for helping me." Harper exchanged glances with his deputies. "Where is he now?" "In the hills, east of town," Becca admitted, seeing no alternative. "Waiting for me to return." The marshal nodded to one of his men. "Take Jennings and Farley, find this Lakota, bring him in, unharmed, you understand? I want to hear his side of this story." "Yes, sir," the deputy replied, moving off to gather additional men. Becca felt sick with fear and guilt. She had brought Makya directly into danger, betrayed him, however unwillingly. Harper took her arm gently but firmly. "Come along, Mrs. Morgan. The town jail isn't much, but it's secure. You'll be comfortable enough until this matter's resolved." As they walked back toward the center of town, Becca tried one last appeal. "Marshal, I'm telling you the truth. The attack on Pine Creek is real. In 3 days, Stockton's gang will come and they won't leave survivors." Harper's pace slowed slightly. "If that's true, we'll be ready. I'm not ignoring your warning, just securing my source until I know who's really who." The Pine Creek jail occupied the back portion of the marshal's office. 3 small cells with iron bars and simple cots. Harper installed Becca in the largest of these, offering her a blanket and a cup of water. "Try to get some rest," he advised, securing the cell door. "Tomorrow may bring clearer perspectives for all of us." Left alone, Becca sat on the narrow cot, despair threatening to overwhelm her. Everything had gone wrong. Instead of finding an ally in Marshal Harper, she had walked into another trap. Worse, she had compromised Makya's safety, the one person who had stood by her through everything. But as the initial shock faded, Becca's mind began working again. Harper had not dismissed her warning entirely. He had copied the information from the map, mentioned preparing the town's defenses. Perhaps all was not lost, and Makya was no helpless victim. He was a skilled scout, attuned to danger. If the deputies approached carelessly, he would sense their intent and vanish into the wilderness long before they reached him. With these slim comforts, Becca stretched out on the cot, her exhausted body demanding rest, despite her troubled mind. She would need her strength for whatever the morning might bring. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by nightmares of Devil's Gate and the faces of the dead. Becca woke fully just before dawn, roused by activity in the marshal's office. Beyond her cell, voices, Harper's among them, but others she didn't recognize. The conversation was heated, though conducted in tones too low to distinguish specific words. A door opened and closed. Footsteps approached the cells. Harper appeared, his expression troubled. "You have visitors, Mrs. Morgan." He stepped aside, revealing 2 figures in the office beyond, Lieutenant Harrington and another officer Becca recognized from the outlaw camp. They had arrived much sooner than seemed possible, suggesting they had already been in the vicinity. Perhaps preparing for the attack on Pine Creek? Harrington approached the cell, a cold smile touching his lips. "Mrs. Morgan, how remarkable to find you here, of all places." "Not so remarkable," Becca replied, struggling to keep her voice steady, "since you're planning to attack this town in 3 days." Harrington's smile didn't waver. "Such wild accusations. First at Fort Bridger, now here. I fear grief has affected your reason, Mrs. Morgan." He turned to Harper. "We'll take custody of the prisoner now, Marshal. Captain Hayes's orders." Harper frowned. "With respect, Lieutenant, I'd like to see those orders, and I have questions about the telegraph you sent." "The orders are verbal," Harrington interrupted sharply. "Direct from Captain Hayes to me. As for the telegraph," he gestured to his companion, "Sergeant Miller here can confirm its authenticity. The woman is wanted for questioning in Marshal Grant's murder." Harper's frown deepened. "That may be, Lieutenant, but this is my jurisdiction until I receive proper documentation stating otherwise." An uncomfortable silence fell between the 2 men. Becca watched the exchange with growing hope. Perhaps Harper wasn't as easily cowed as Harrington had expected. "Very well," the lieutenant said finally, his tone clipped. "We'll dispatch a rider to Fort Bridger for the formal papers. In the meantime, the prisoner remains in your custody, but under our guard." "That won't be necessary," Harper began, but Harrington cut him off. "It's not a request, Marshal. This woman is dangerous. She and her savage companion killed an officer of the law. My men will ensure she doesn't escape while we await proper documentation." Harper's jaw tightened, but he nodded reluctantly. "Your men can stand watch outside the jail, but this is still my town, Lieutenant. I expect them to remember that." The implied threat hung in the air between them. For a moment, Becca thought Harrington might challenge the marshal directly. Instead, he inclined his head in mock deference. "Of course, Marshal Harper. We're all on the same side, after all." The words dripped with insincerity. Harrington turned back to Becca, his expression hardening. "We'll speak again soon, Mrs. Morgan," at length. To Harper, he added, "What about the Indian? Your telegram mentioned he was with her." "My men are looking for him," Harper replied. "No sign yet." Relief flooded through Becca. Makya had evaded capture as she had hoped and expected. He was still free, still able to act. "Increase the search," Harrington ordered. "That savage is as dangerous as she is. More, perhaps." After the lieutenant and sergeant departed, Harper approached Becca's cell again. "You've made powerful enemies, Mrs. Morgan." "Not enemies I chose," she replied. "But yes, powerful ones." The marshal studied her thoughtfully. "I copied your map, as I said I would. Sent men to scout the approaches you indicated. If Stockton's gang is coming, we'll be prepared." "Thank you," Becca said sincerely. "But what about Harrington? The others involved?" Harper glanced toward the door through which the officers had departed. "I'm reserving judgment there. The lieutenant's manner doesn't inspire confidence, I'll grant you that." He lowered his voice. "Between us, I sent a telegraph of my own last night to the territorial governor directly. Unusual circumstances warrant unusual measures." Hope sparked in Becca's chest. "And the governor will send help?" "If he believes my message," Harper replied. "It's a lot to swallow. Army officers in league with outlaws, a massacre covered up, a U.S. Marshal murdered. But the governor's a careful man. He'll investigate at least." "How long will that take?" Becca asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "Too long to help with the immediate situation," Harper admitted. "That's our responsibility, yours and mine." "Mine," Becca repeated. "How can I help from in here?" Harper smiled grimly. "By staying exactly where you are, for now. Harrington believes he has you contained. As long as that's true, he won't change whatever plans are in motion." He tapped the bars thoughtfully. "Sometimes the best trap is the one the quarry thinks they've avoided." The implications of his statement were clear. Harper was using her as bait, keeping Harrington focused on her while preparing his own countermeasures. It was a dangerous game, with Becca at its center. "And Makya?" she asked. "My friend?" "Best if he stays free," Harper replied. "My men have genuine orders to find him, but I'd be lying if I said I'm disappointed they haven't succeeded." The marshal's strategy made sense, but it left Becca with an uncomfortable role, passive prisoner, while others acted around her. It went against every instinct she had developed since the massacre, every lesson in self-reliance she had learned. "I need you to trust me," Harper said, reading her expression. "Just for a little while longer." Before Becca could respond, the office door opened. One of Harper's deputies entered, his expression urgent. "Marshal, riders coming, a lot of them." Harper straightened, hand moving to his sidearm. "Harrington's men?" The deputy shook his head. "Don't think so. Approaching from the north, not the east. Moving fast." "Stockton," Becca breathed. "They've changed their timeline." Harper's face hardened with resolve. "Or they were always coming today, and the date on your map was deliberate misinformation." He turned to his deputy. "Sound the alarm. Get every able-bodied man to defensive positions. Women and children to the church basement." And as the deputy rushed to comply, Harper unlocked Becca's cell. "So much for keeping you contained," he said grimly. "If this is truly Stockton's gang, I need every hand that can hold a weapon." He retrieved her small pistol from his desk drawer and returned it to her. "6 shots," he noted. "Make them count." Becca checked the weapon with practiced hands, a skill she had acquired only recently, but one that now felt natural. "What about Harrington, his men?" "We're about to find out whose side they're really on," Harper replied, selecting a rifle from the rack on the wall and thrusting it into her hands. Can you shoot this?" Becca nodded. Her father had insisted she learn rifle marksmanship in Ohio, despite her mother's objections that it wasn't ladylike. One of many skills she had once considered unnecessary, but now recognized as essential. "Good," Harper said. "Follow me." Outside, Pine Creek had erupted into organized chaos. Men rushed to barricade the main street. Women hurried children toward the stone church. Shopkeepers boarded windows while clutching shotguns and pistols. Harrington and his soldiers had gathered near the saloon, watching the activity with expressions ranging from confusion to alarm. The lieutenant spotted Becca immediately, his face darkening with anger. "Marshal!" he shouted, striding toward them. "What is the meaning of this? The prisoner is the least of our concerns right now, Lieutenant." Harper cut him off. "We have riders approaching from the north. 24 at least, moving with purpose." Harrington faltered, genuine, surprise crossing his features. "That's impossible. They're not due until—" He caught himself, but too late. Harper's eyes narrowed. "Not due until when, Lieutenant? The day marked on Mrs. Morgan's map, perhaps?" Trapped by his own words, Harrington's hand moved toward his holster. "You're making a serious mistake, Marshal." The only mistake was trusting a man who wears that uniform unworthily, Harper replied, his own hand resting on his sidearm. "Now I suggest you decide quickly which side you're on today. Stockton's gang is minutes away, and Pine Creek will defend itself, with or without your help." The standoff lasted only seconds, though it felt much longer to Becca. Then a shout from the north end of town broke the tension. "Riders, coming fast!" Harrington made his decision, drawing his pistol in one smooth motion and aiming at Harper. "Stockton's not the only one with men, Marshal." Before he could fire, a shot rang out from the direction of the general store. Harrington staggered, a look of surprise crossing his face as a crimson stain spread across his shoulder. He dropped to one knee, his weapon falling from suddenly nerveless fingers. Sergeant Miller and the other soldiers froze, caught between loyalty to their corrupt officer and self-preservation. "Drop your weapons," Harper commanded, "or join the lieutenant on the ground." For a tense moment, Becca thought the soldiers would fight. Then Miller slowly raised his hands, the others following suit as townspeople with rifles surrounded them. "Secure them in the jail," Harper ordered two of his deputies. "We'll sort out traitors after we deal with Stockton." As the soldiers were led away, Becca scanned the buildings, wondering who had fired the shot that felled Harrington. A figure on the general store's roof caught her attention, a man in buckskins, a rifle in his hands, his dark hair adorned with a single feather. Makya, relief flooded through her. He had not abandoned Pine Creek, despite the danger. Instead, he had taken up a position that allowed him to watch over the town and her. Their eyes met across the distance, a moment of silent communication that required no words. Then Makya shifted his attention northward, raising his rifle in warning. "They're here!" someone shouted. The thunder of hooves filled the air as the first riders appeared at the north end of town. Rough-looking men with bandanas covering the lower portions of their faces, rifles and pistols at the ready. Stockton rode at their head, his scarred face visible as he surveyed the town's hasty defenses. Finding barricades and armed defenders instead of the easy target he had expected, Stockton raised his hand, signaling his men to halt just beyond effective rifle range. "What now?" Becca asked, crouching beside Harper behind an overturned wagon. "Now we find out if 20 determined outlaws are willing to face an entire town prepared to defend itself," the marshal replied grimly. "My guess is they expected surprise, not resistance." Indeed, the outlaws seemed to be reassessing their approach, gathered in a loose huddle around their leader. After a brief consultation, 3 riders detached from the main group, approaching, under a white flag of truce. That's Stockton himself, Becca whispered, recognizing the central figure, the one with the scar. Harper nodded. Let's hear what he has to say. To the defenders he called, "Hold your fire, but stay ready." The 3 riders stopped 30 yards from the barricade. Stockton removed his bandana, revealing the full extent of the jagged scar that ran from his jaw to his throat. "We're looking for Marshal Harper," he called, his voice carrying easily in the tense silence. Harper rose slowly, rifle held ready, but not aimed directly. "I'm Harper. What's your business in Pine Creek?" Stockton smiled without humor. "Just passing through, Marshal. No need for all this." He gestured at the barricades. "Unfriendly reception. Passing through with 20 armed men, faces covered," Harper replied skeptically. "That's not the behavior of honest travelers." Stockton's expression hardened. "We heard rumors of Indian trouble in these parts. Safety in numbers. The only trouble here is the kind you bring yourself," Harper said bluntly. "I suggest you and your men ride on, far and fast." A dangerous light entered Stockton's eyes. "That's not very hospitable, Marshal, especially when we have mutual acquaintances." His gaze shifted, finding Becca where she crouched behind the barricade. "Mrs. Morgan." What a surprise. Becca felt a chill run through her at being recognized, but she stood slowly, rifle held ready. "Not much of a surprise, Mr. Stockton. We knew you were coming." Confusion flickered across the outlaw's scarred features. "Did you now? And how would you know?" "That? The same way I know you murdered my husband and our entire wagon train at Devil's Gate," Becca replied, her voice steady despite the hatred coursing through her. "The same way I know you've been working with corrupt officers from Fort Bridger. We found your camp, saw your map, heard your plans." Stockton's expression shifted from confusion to anger. "You've been busy for a dead woman, Mrs. Morgan." "Not as dead as you left me," she countered. "Not as dead as you'll be if you don't ride away from Pine Creek right now." The outlaw leader laughed harshly. "Big words from a woman. You and what army are going to make us leave?" "This one," Harper replied, gesturing to the rooftops and windows where dozens of armed townspeople had taken position. "Plus whatever reinforcements are currently circling behind your men." It was a bluff. Becca knew Pine Creek had no additional forces, but Stockton couldn't be certain. He glanced uneasily over his shoulder, then back at Harper. "You're making a mistake, Marshal," he said, unconsciously echoing Harrington's earlier words. "We have friends in high places, the kind who can make a small town like this disappear from maps entirely. And we have evidence that will see those friends hanging alongside you," Harper countered. "Last chance, Stockton. Ride away or we open fire." For a moment, Becca thought the outlaw leader might order an attack despite the unfavorable odds. Then with a curse, he yanked his horse around. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Not by a long shot." The 3 riders rejoined their companions at the edge of town. After a brief, animated discussion, the entire gang wheeled their mounts and galloped away, dust rising in their wake as they disappeared over the northern ridge. A cheer went up from the defenders of Pine Creek, quickly hushed by Harper's raised hand. "They could be circling around," he cautioned. "Stay alert. Thomas, take 4 men and follow at a distance. Make sure they're truly leaving, not just regrouping." As the townspeople maintained their defensive positions, Makya appeared at Becca's side, moving with his characteristic silence. "They go," he said confidently. "For now. Too many guns here, not enough surprise." Harper eyed the Lakota scout with a mixture of wariness and respect. "Your shot saved my life, stranger. Pine Creek owes you thanks." Makya acknowledged this with a slight nod. "No thanks needed. Protect Becca, protect town. Same purpose." The marshal studied him thoughtfully. "You're the one they claimed murdered Marshal Grant." "Grant already dead when we found outlaw camp," Makya replied. "Harrington and Stockton kill him. Blame us." Harper sighed heavily. "That matches what Mrs. Morgan told me. And seeing Harrington with Stockton today," he shook his head. Hard to believe men wearing the uniform could stoop so low. Believe, Makya said simply. See with own eyes. Indeed, Harrington's reaction to the approaching riders had confirmed everything Becca had claimed. The lieutenant now sat in his own jail cell, his wounded shoulder bandaged, but his expression murderous as he watched Harper approach. "You've made a fatal mistake, Marshal," Harrington spat. "When Captain Hayes hears about this, he'll have bigger concerns than your wounded pride," Harper interrupted, tossing a telegraph onto the cell's small table. "This arrived an hour ago. The territorial governor has ordered a full investigation into Fort Bridge's command structure based on evidence I sent last night." Harrington's face paled. "What evidence?" "You have nothing but the word of a hysterical widow and a savage." "I have your own reaction when I mentioned riders approaching," Harper replied calmly. "I have witnesses who saw you draw on a lawman instead of defending a town under threat. I have a map showing planned attacks found in an outlaw camp where you were seen meeting with Stockton himself." The lieutenant's bravado crumbled visibly. "Hayes will deny everything. It's my word against yours." "Perhaps," Harper acknowledged, "but Stockton's still out there. Men like him have a habit of talking when their necks are on the line. How loyal do you think he'll be when we catch him?" Leaving Harrington to contemplate this uncomfortable truth, Harper rejoined Becca and Makya outside. The town remained on alert, though scouts had confirmed Stockton's gang was indeed retreating northward. "What happens now?" Becca asked. "Now we prepare for their return," Harper replied grimly. "Men like Stockton don't surrender easily, and he has too much to lose if the truth about Devil's Gate comes out. We could track them," Makya suggested. "Find camp, see what they plan." The marshal considered this, then nodded slowly. "That might be our best option, but not alone. I'll send 2 of my men with you." "I'm going too," Becca declared, her tone allowing no argument. Harper looked as though he might object, then seemed to think better of it. "Very well. But this is reconnaissance only, understand? Find where they're camped, then return. We'll plan our next move from there." As they prepared for this new mission, gathering supplies and selecting the deputies who would accompany them, Becca found herself standing beside Makya at the town's edge, gazing northward where Stockton had disappeared. "We're close," she said softly. "Close to justice for Samuel and the others." Makya nodded, his dark eyes solemn. "Justice important, but after—" He hesitated, then continued. "After justice, what then?" The question echoed her own thoughts from days earlier. What would she do once vengeance was achieved? Where would she go? Who would she become? "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I'm beginning to see possibilities I couldn't imagine before." She glanced at Makya, finding him watching her with an expression that made her heart beat faster. They had traveled so far together, faced so many dangers side by side. He had become more than an ally, more than a friend, perhaps. "We find justice first," he said, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it. "Then find path forward. Together, maybe." The word hung between them. Together, laden with possibilities neither of them had dared voice until now. A future that crossed boundaries of culture and expectation, yet felt more right than any conventional path Becca could imagine. "Maybe," she agreed softly. "First, we find Stockton." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across Pine Creek, Becca felt a strange sense of calm despite the dangers that lay ahead. For the first time since the massacre, she was looking forward rather than backward, seeing possibility instead of only loss. The path ahead remained fraught with peril. Stockton's gang still threatened. The corrupt officers at Fort Bridge still wielded power. Justice remained unserved. But she no longer faced these challenges alone. With Makya at her side and allies like Marshal Harper supporting their cause, Becca felt a strength that transcended mere survival. Whatever came next, pursuit, confrontation, the final reckoning. With those who had destroyed her former life, she would face it not just with determination, but with hope. As they prepared to depart, tracking their enemies into the wilderness once more, Becca touched the spot where her gold locket had once rested, the connection to her past now gone, but no longer needed as desperately as before. The woman she was becoming required different strengths, different treasures. The tracking party departed Pine Creek as evening shadows lengthened. Becca, Makya, and two of Harper's most experienced deputies, Morgan and Davis. They moved northward, following the clear trail left by Stockton's retreating gang. "They're not bothering to hide their tracks," Deputy Morgan observed as they rode. "Either they're in a mighty hurry, or they want us to follow." "Trap," Makya stated simply, his eyes scanning the horizon. "But not here. Too open. Later, when trail enters canyon." The deputies exchanged uneasy glances, but none disputed Makya's assessment. His skills as a tracker had already proven invaluable, identifying details in the outlaws' trail that even the experienced lawmen missed. They made camp at nightfall in a sheltered draw, building only the smallest of fires to cook a sparse meal. As the others prepared to sleep, Makya touched Becca's arm. "I scout ahead," he said quietly. "See where trail leads." "Alone?" Becca frowned, concern evident in her voice. "It's too dangerous. Safer alone. Move silent. See more." He gestured at the deputies. "White men make noise, even good ones." Despite her misgivings, Becca recognized the wisdom in his plan. "Be careful," she urged, her hand lingering on his arm. "Return by dawn." Makya nodded, his eyes meeting hers with unspoken understanding. Then he disappeared into the darkness, moving with the silent grace that still amazed her. The night passed. Slowly, Becca taking her turn at watch alongside the deputies. Her mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. Confrontation with Stockton, the ultimate fate of Harrington and his corrupt colleagues, the uncertain future that would follow. Dawn brought a pale glow to the eastern sky, but no sign of Makya. As minutes stretched into an hour, Becca's concern deepened into fear. "We should search for him," she urged Deputy Morgan, who had assumed leadership of their small group. The deputy frowned, checking his pocket watch. "Give him till full sunrise. Man knows what he's doing out there." Another half hour passed before Makya finally appeared, emerging from the morning mist like a spirit. His expression was grim, his movements showing unusual tension. "Found them," he reported without preamble. 5 miles north. Camp in Box Canyon." "How many?" Morgan asked. 17, 3 wounded from town fight." Makya's eyes shifted to Becca. "Stockton plans rush back to Pine Creek tonight. Surprise attack from west side." The deputies exchanged alarmed glances. "We need to warn the marshal," Davis said urgently. Makya wasn't finished. "More news. Army patrol coming from Fort Bridger, led by captain with gray hair." "Hayes," Becca breathed, recognizing the description of the corrupt officer she had seen at the outlaw camp. "How far?" "Half-day's ride, coming to meet Stockton." Makya's expression darkened further. "Talk of burning Pine Creek. No witnesses." The full implications settled over the group like a shadow. This was no longer about robbing a settlement, it was about eliminating everyone who could testify about the corruption and murder that connected Fort Bridger's officers to Stockton's outlaws. "We need to split up," Morgan decided. "Davis, ride back to Pine Creek. Warn Harper about the attack planned for tonight. The rest of us will track Hayes's patrol." "No," Becca interjected firmly. "Hayes will have scouts ahead of his main group. They'll spot 3 riders easily." She considered their options. "Makya and I should continue alone." We can move faster. Stay hidden better. The deputies looked skeptical, but Makya nodded in agreement. She right. 2 better than 3 for this. Morgan rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. The marshal won't like it, he sighed. But time's short and stakes are high. Just reconnaissance, understand? Find Hayes, confirm his strength and direction, then return to Pine Creek immediately. Understood, Becca agreed, though she had no intention of retreating if an opportunity presented itself to gather evidence against Hayes directly. Within minutes, they had divided supplies and separated. Davis heading back to Pine Creek with urgent warnings, Morgan following to reinforce the town's defenses, while Becca and Makya set off in pursuit of the approaching army patrol. They rode hard through the morning, following Makya's directions toward the route Hayes's men would likely take. By midday, they had reached a ridge overlooking a broad valley where the trail from Fort Bridger cut through open country. There, Makya pointed to a dust cloud in the distance. Army patrol. Becca shaded her eyes, estimating their numbers. At least a dozen. Too many to confront directly. They watched as the patrol advanced steadily toward the rendezvous point Stockton had apparently arranged. Leading the column was a figure Becca recognized immediately, Captain Hayes, his gray hair visible even at this distance. We need proof of their connection, she said, thinking aloud. Something that links Hayes directly to Stockton and the attacks. Makya considered this. Follow patrol to meeting place. See with own eyes, hear with own ears. It was risky but necessary. Without definitive evidence connecting the corrupt officers to the outlaws, Hayes and others might escape justice, even if Stockton were captured or killed. They paralleled the patrol's route, keeping to higher ground where trees and rocks provided cover. By late afternoon, Hayes's men had reached the appointed meeting place, a natural clearing near the entrance to the Box Canyon where Stockton's gang had made camp. Makya led Becca to a concealed position on a rocky outcropping overlooking the clearing. They settled in to wait, watching as the soldiers established a temporary camp with the efficiency of trained men. Twilight was gathering when Stockton himself rode into the clearing, accompanied by 2 lieutenants. The outlaws approached cautiously, but Hayes greeted them with the familiarity of long association. Though too distant to hear their conversation, clearly the body language was unmistakable. These were co-conspirators, not adversaries. Maps were spread on a makeshift table, plans discussed, agreements reached with handshakes. We need to get closer, Becca whispered. Hear what they're saying. Makya nodded grimly. They backtracked down the slope, then circled through dense underbrush until they reached a position much nearer to the meeting, still concealed, but close enough to catch fragments of conversation carried on the evening breeze. Midnight. Attack from 3 sides, Hayes was saying. Harper won't expect such numbers so soon. My men are ready, Stockton replied. But this is the last time, Hayes. After Pine Creek burns, I want my payment in full. The captain's laugh carried clearly. You'll get your gold. Governor's shipment leaves Denver next week, our last opportunity before the investigation reaches that far. Becca and Makya exchanged glances of shock. The conspiracy extended beyond, raiding wagon trains and small settlements. They were planning to intercept government gold shipments. And the woman, Morgan's widow? Stockton asked. Harrington said she knows too much. Harrington's a fool who got himself captured, Hayes dismissed. But he's right about one thing. The woman dies tonight, along with anyone who's heard her story. Cold fury washed through Becca at the casual way these men discussed murder, her murder, the slaughter of an entire town, all to protect their criminal enterprise and the gold it had brought them. As the meeting continued, Hayes retrieved a leather portfolio from his saddlebag, extracting papers that appeared to detail their operation. This was it, the documentary evidence that could prove the conspiracy beyond doubt. Becca motioned to Makya, pointing toward the portfolio. He understood immediately, but shook his head in warning. There were too many soldiers, too many guns. A direct attempt to seize the documents would be suicide. But as they watched, an unexpected opportunity presented itself. Hayes handed the portfolio to an aide, instructing him to secure it in the captain's tent. The young soldier moved away from the main group, carrying the valuable evidence. Makya touched Becca's arm, indicating a path that would intercept the aide before he reached the tent. With a nod of understanding, they slipped away from their hiding place, moving silently through deepening shadows. The aide never saw them coming. Makya's hand clamped over the young soldier's mouth from behind, while Becca relieved him of the portfolio. Within seconds, they had retreated into the darkness, leaving the confused aide to wonder what had happened. They didn't stop until they had reached their horses, hidden half a mile away. Only then did Becca open the portfolio, confirming its contents in the last light of dusk. Detailed records of payments, maps of attack sites, names of collaborators within the army and territorial government, and planned future operations. "This proves everything," she whispered, heart pounding with the significance of what they had found. Names, dates, locations. Hayes documented it all. "Must reach Pine Creek," Makya urged, "before attack starts." They mounted swiftly, pushing their horses to a gallop despite the gathering darkness. Behind them, a commotion had erupted in the army camp, the theft discovered, riders beginning to search the surrounding area. "They'll expect us to head directly for Pine Creek," Becca realized aloud. "We need another route." Makya nodded. "No different way. Longer, but safer." He led them on a winding path through terrain too rough for pursuit at night, eventually circling westward before turning south toward Pine Creek. The journey took hours, their tired horses struggling over difficult ground, but no pursuers managed to follow their elusive trail. It was well past midnight when they finally spotted the lights of Pine Creek in the distance. The town appeared quiet. No sign of the attack Hayes and Stockton had planned. "We made it in time," Becca said with relief. As they approached the town's edge, however, something felt wrong. The streets were too quiet, the buildings too dark for a settlement preparing for imminent attack. A figure emerged from shadows near the livery stable. Marshal Harper, rifle in hand, expression grim. "You're too late," he said without preamble. "Stockton's men hit us an hour ago. From the east, not the west, as your deputy reported." Becca's heart sank. "Casualties?" "3 dead, several wounded. We drove them back, but they've regrouped on the North Ridge." Harper eyed the portfolio Becca clutched. "What did you find?" "Everything," she replied, handing him the leather case. "Names, plans, payment records, and Hayes is a half day behind us with a full patrol. They're planning to burn Pine Creek to the ground tonight. No survivors." Harper cursed softly, quickly examining the documents by lamplight. "This changes everything. We need to evacuate now." "No," Becca countered firmly. "That's exactly what they want. To scatter us, pick us off one by one in the open." "What's your alternative?" Harper demanded. "We're outnumbered, outgunned." Makya spoke up. "Use documents, evidence more valuable than gold to them." Understanding dawned in Becca's eyes. He's right. Their whole operation depends on secrecy. These papers expose everything if we can get them to the territorial governor. "That's a mighty big if," Harper pointed out. "Denver's a week's hard ride, and we've got outlaws on one side, corrupt soldiers on the other. Then we make them destroy each other," Becca suggested, an audacious plan forming in her mind. Hayes and Stockton are partners, but partners with different interests. If Stockton believed Hayes was betraying him... Harper caught on quickly. "We could use these documents, make it look like Hayes was planning to eliminate Stockton all along." "Exactly. Stockton strikes first, weakens Hayes's forces, and we strike in the confusion," Harper finished. "Risky, but it might work." They worked quickly, selecting specific documents that suggested Hayes had always intended to eliminate Stockton once their largest operation, the governor's gold shipment, was complete. A deputy who could mimic Hayes's handwriting added convincing notes in the margins. Before dawn, Makya slipped out of town with the doctored documents, tasked with ensuring they reached Stockton's camp in a way that appeared to be accidental discovery rather than deliberate plant. The waiting was agonizing for Becca. Morning came with no word, no action from either Stockton or Hayes. She helped tend the wounded from the previous night's attack, all while watching the ridges surrounding Pine Creek for any sign of movement. Midday brought the first indication their plan might be working. The sound of gunfire erupted from the direction of Hayes's camp, a sustained exchange suggesting serious conflict. "It's begun," Harper observed grimly. Stockton's turned on Hayes. He gathered his deputies and the able-bodied men of Pine Creek, forming them into organized units, prepared to move when the moment was right. Makya returned shortly afterward, slipping into town unnoticed by most. "Stockton attacked Hayes," he confirmed. "Many dead on both sides, fighting still." "And the portfolio?" Becca asked anxiously. "Safe, hidden where only we find." He produced the genuine documents, which he had switched for the altered versions before making his escape. By late afternoon, scouts reported both Stockton's gang and Hayes's patrol had been reduced to perhaps half their original strength. The corrupt captain and the outlaw leader had apparently both survived, however, and were regrouping for what appeared to be a final confrontation. "Now's our chance," Harper decided. "They're weak and divided. We hit them before they can recover." The men of Pine Creek moved out at dusk, approaching from directions neither Stockton nor Hayes would expect. Becca insisted on accompanying them, the small pistol replaced with a proper rifle and a determination that would not be denied. The final confrontation played out in the gathering darkness. Hayes and Stockton, former partners now mortal enemies, caught between their own mutual hostility and the unexpected attack from the townspeople they had planned to slaughter. Gunfire echoed across the hills, muzzle flashes illuminating the chaotic scene in strobe-like glimpses. Becca found herself separated from the main group, working her way around the eastern flank of the battlefield. A movement caught her eye. A figure climbing the ridge, attempting to escape the melee below. Even in the poor light, she recognized him immediately. Stockton, the scarred face unmistakable as he glanced back over his shoulder. The man who had ordered the Devil's Gate massacre, who had left her for dead among the bodies of her husband and friends, was trying to slip away while his men died fighting. Cold resolve filled her as she followed, keeping to shadows, her footsteps masked by the ongoing gunfire. She tracked him to the crest of the ridge, where he paused to catch his breath, apparently believing himself safe. "Stockton!" Her voice carried clearly in the sudden quiet. He whirled, pistol rising, but froze. At the sight of Becca standing 20 paces away, rifle aimed steadily at his chest. Recognition dawned in his eyes. "The Widow Morgan," he said, a sneer forming on his scarred face. "You should have stayed dead at Devil's Gate." "Many things should have been different that day," Becca replied, her voice remarkably calm. "But they weren't, and now justice has found you anyway." Stockton's expression shifted, calculation replacing contempt. "Justice? Or vengeance, Mrs. Morgan? Are you any better than me if you gun me down in cold blood?" "I don't claim to be better," Becca answered. "Just luckier I survived to see this day." His hand tightened on his pistol. "Then let's see who's luckier now." What happened next occurred in the blink of an eye. Stockton firing, Becca diving. Sideways, as she squeezed her own trigger, pain lanced through her left arm as his bullet grazed her, but her shot found its mark. Stockton staggered, clutching his chest, disbelief evident in his eyes as he fell to his knees. "How?" he gasped. "I learned," Becca said simply, standing over him, "from people better than you could ever understand." His eyes clouded as life departed, the architect of so much suffering finally facing the consequences of his actions. In the valley below, the fighting had largely subsided. Pine Creek's defenders had emerged victorious, capturing Hayes and the handful of survivors from both factions. The evidence in the portfolio would ensure trials and justice rather than summary execution, proper endings to the long cycle of violence. Makya found Becca still standing on the ridgetop, her rifle lowered, gaze fixed on the distant horizon where dawn would eventually come. "You hurt," he observed quietly, noting the blood on her sleeve. "It's nothing," she replied. "Just a graze." He moved beside her, his presence a comfort more powerful than words. For a long moment they stood in silence, the weight of all that had happened, all they had survived together, settling around them like a shared cloak. "It's over," Becca said finally. "Samuel and the others, they have justice now." Makya nodded. "Justice important, but living more important." She turned to face him, really seeing him in a way that transcended their many shared dangers and hardships. "You asked me once what I would do after justice was found. I think I'm ready to answer that question now." His dark eyes held hers, patient, accepting whatever she might say. "I want to learn," Becca continued, "about your people's healing ways, about living in balance with the land, about building something new from what remains after loss." A rare smile touched Makya's lips. "My people say when old path ends, new path begins, sometimes with unexpected companion." They descended the ridge together toward Pine Creek and the future that awaited, a future neither of them could have, imagined before fate and tragedy had intertwined their journeys. The path ahead remained uncertain, bridging worlds that had long stood apart. But in that uncertainty lay possibility, and in possibility, hope. And hope, Becca had learned, was the most powerful medicine of all. Up next, you've got two more. Standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.